Abstract Metaphysical Foundations 10/8/2010. I am the One. I am you. We are one. We are all the manifest subjects lost deep everywhere within the eternal cosmic abyss, revelating across a seemingly endless, eternal universe, that every object summoned into perception, returning from sensation, is reflected from the internal will of the absolute knowing subject. I am the subject. I could very well be the absolute knower within this lifetime, upholding, summoning, and supporting the very will across the eternal and almighty universe. When I become dead, this world is gone. When I become alive, resurrected, more than likely again and again, the world is here, new, from its beginning, with a chance and opportunity restored and recognized once more and again. Everything, all the representation within the world, all of the knowledge and symbolism, everything therein is possible to collect and assimilate into dimensions of the understanding, distantly and with enough time, over the course of many spanned aeons, that the very objectifications of the will inevitably become understood well enough that all surrounding me and becoming summoned is sourced back to and returned to the very will that is upheld, maintained, and resurrected in the very state and condition that I am in. Everything, the universe, the world, the reflections therein, can become known in relation to the subject, and known how they can resonate, speak, visualize, or feel, etc., for the very reason they are appearing to me in time and space. I, formed and characterized in this very subject, as a particular and molecular reflection toward others within the universe and throughout, have come to find that the very individual objectifications of this will are upheld in regard to a relative knowledge that is far surpassed by no other form, representation, or idea, that this very knowledge I foreshadow is mysterious in its origin and unlikely to be explained in its beginning, for the very ideas therein its system appertain to everything within the very universe that could not likely have been individually discovered, yet more than likely integrated and assimilated over time, by further study, by several hordes of students, and by many various generations, that eventually gave birth to and conceived of the Kabbalah, and therewith had given the implementation use to it. For enough information, data, knowledge of it had so far been discovered, passed over, and made known, after all its time since handed over so secretively. Likewise, the Kabbalah stands in relation to the Tarot. The Tarot as well appears in a similar origination as to the Kabbalah, mysterious, clouded by fanciful sources, over time, assimilated and informed through enough dialectic, realized from secrecy and hidden cloak, made available in latter eras for any purpose the student therewith seeks it in. It is terrible in its beginning, as with anything, to become informed of such a thing, as everything stands in relation to the absolute knower, reflected outside of this very knowing subject's will, sourced back to directly within the brain, that the arms, chest, abdomen, etc., as such, a part of the subject, but only made visible and apparent to the subject through the various and studious utilization of the intellect, over time finally becoming conceived in a relative degree of knowledge and understanding toward anything that outside it calls into becoming known. With time and experience, however, should come further results in the studying student's intellect, coming about from through reflection. The subject that is within this time, through enough communication and dialectical instruction between itself, the knower, and of the world, should then bring to the knower a certain sense of divorce, division, disfigurement, and a suggestive reason to object and doubt all the world, the very thing, known by itself, that had possessed for so much the subject such a habitual and longly oriented time, that then the subject, inevitably, in result, should come to doubt the knowledge, the validity of its purpose, its ego, etc., to therefore inevitably invert or convert the very geological spectrum or pyramid, and commence the downfall from its very geological summit that it once had known itself to be located from. Perhaps it is when this procession once takes shape and finishes its course, it is therein found, commenced, and relocated inside its will, a specific kernel that gradually sprouts fresh a new leaf, eventually blooms forth a tree, of life, almost literally, with its arms juxtaposed and its feet firmly rooted in the ground. There the very 10 Sephiroth take their form, and thus suggestively dawn and begin the age of its enlightenment, the various degrees of coloration, form, element, and source that commits to the subject an everlasting reward, resource, and appendage to strive for, if ever there was a deed and need to perform, yet in doubt, if there were ever anything that called into question the very need for something to suffer, exist, or strive for, that all the so-named Sephiroth belonging to the tree of life shall give to the subject, while upon question and study, the capability to reason its very existence, to find the purpose to everything within the subject's objectified reflection, that this very existence expounded by the knower should ground firmly and steadily enough to inevitably release the secret seals hidden beneath its name, fate, and character, and to eventually arrive toward the very degree of understanding that licenses and permits its form to undergo a kind of general surgery that after all frees it from and abolishes and destroys its very will, close enough and far enough in the denial of its very state. Nevertheless, with everything in its objectified form, or in its phenomenal appearance, in relation to the will of the subject, the absolute knowing subject, that is within time and space, that is that I am, everything now becomes a sentence for the subject, a reason for enlightenment, a preponderant state of eternal and everlasting knowing, that everything in its objectified form can therein become imparted, broken into, compounded into elements, in reference to a particular organ, to color, shape, word, number, or concept, its idea as it is wished. Absolutely everything summoned by its reason into the intellect, broken down and reformed, understood, judged, and therefore mastered, made effect by the essential substance of all that is matter, all that is known, in particular form, by the absolute knowing subject. Perhaps that when it is I that is deceased, it is you that is reading this that I take my form therein to begin. For no matter how hard I try to tell this to you, it is all the while felt within me that I, as I am, speak none other than toward myself, to myself, and by myself, and that it is inevitable that I am to become reformed upon my death and consequential birth into a reiterated, recalculated, and redefined state that substantially becomes evidenced once again, for by nature and her time and experience somehow conceives of and gives birth to all of the many infinite and various objects being called into question, everything in substance and form, everything that I am. When the color of red is made apparent to the intellect of the knowing subject, it should be conceived of in the mind the absolute notion of severity, that this notion be made aligned with many other notions and concepts, that they trace around the object made visible enough to inevitably make sense to the subject, that the reason for this very color red made known is for the purpose to reflect upon and proceed to understand the will's sentiment, feeling, and striving upon to manifest it onto the intellect, that of the notion or concept of severity, the number 5, the planet of Mars, etc. Also that the various tarot trump cards in relation to that very color ought to be taken into consideration upon reflection, such as the Chariot, strength or fortitude, or lust, justice, the hanged man, the various concepts, words, and letters appertaining therein to these included notions. Something not to advise upon would be to evidence, in pure reason, the shape of a square, and immediately refer its knowledge to the notion of mother, water, black, or the number 3, as this latter can easily be observed. Yet otherwise to cast judgment upon the reason for the square's appearance would, with enough time and experience, readily confirm for the subject the need, striving for, and overall reason for the will to refer toward it, relate with, and understand with it the notions and concepts such as father, fire, gray, emperor, etc. Giving the example of this is to consist of rather a limited view, albeit sufficient enough to employ in its instruction. What knowledge can the subject possibly arrive toward? What will it eventually understand? Can it be that everything that the will objectifies and that the intellect reflects upon can become understood, assimilated, judged, and mastered into not more than 4 or 5 elements, into not more than 10 or 11 numbers, or nothing more than 10 or 11 things, all in themselves? That is in so far as the matter consists of Kabbalah. The tarot must not be forgotten, though remembered as importantly and significantly as the former must be supposed. For no matter how hard the subject tries to tell something towards its very reflection, albeit through intelligible word, sound, or sorcery, the object that perceives itself in the subject relates to it just as profoundly as the you does to the I, as I do to you. Whatever knowledge I know makes its effect, so long and so far as whatever thing objectified is made into form, and therefore it perceives it perceives to make an eventual understanding, so long as I will thee before thee, and so far as I will thee beneath thee, above and below. The tree that gives the subject its very life, enlightenment, and everlasting knowledge, and in particular to the absolute knowing subject, in time and space, and thereon into everlasting will. October 8, 2010. 10/16/2010. I understand but now, as it is so late within my historical progression, the very few certain incredible things that shaped my form and defined my character, as it was so deep within this monstrous and luminous abyss. It swallowed my soul. It perhaps sold myself to the devil. Yet nevertheless it ultimately was a very confusing thing to attempt to speak about, and to give it some kind of ultimately representative and meaningful statement. Looking ever so deeply, it appeared to me that the kind of physical composition determined by the objectification of my body gave away, before the world, a certain sense of injustice unto my part, a kind of disapproval, condemnation, and mistrust, in regard to almost everything that my formation attempted to improve. It seemed that wherever I was, wherever my body had made itself apparent, especially in front of a self-conscious humanity, that the eyes directed onto my form cast judgment, however over time it may be, but that the judgment cast itself as evident by many various subjects became a kind of struggle, a schematic game, that is, where all of it necessitated for me the need to cast back an appearance, an image, a kind of representation that would, through enough time, change and alter the course of my condemned and disapproved self toward the forefront of the imagination that the many and various believers and subjects stood in the way to perceive. How everything came to be over time, in regard to this sufferable state, it can be evidenced already, in person most especially, though never did I desire to lead this character into the formidable pit of the surrounding crowd and chatter of humanity that so nefariously intended me to submit to, so it seemed in the long run that everything became perilous, combative and wearisome, a dialectical battle, a war, for the sight and perception of other life and spirituality onto the forefront of my state, and the subsequent dialogue and response of disapproval was damaging, troublesome, and mutilating over such time. Now as it is to this day, the feelings and thoughts directed onto this world have certainly grown to pass and come to mature, slower and corrected, calculated and rationalized, within such space. However, it is the left-over and remaining cataclysms of the abominable historical past that altered and gave credible to every notion, in the formation and designation of my character, as it might be for the most part and to this day. In any event, to summarize the very ideas that denoted and commenced the determination of my struggle to its progression and ultimate end, I would need to describe the reason behind the many scowls, looks, and glances that appeared before me whenever I was within a public and auditorial setting, that the very pessimistic and misshapen countenances came about as a direct result of a kind of pessimistic and evil-looking stare, on my part, that is, seems entirely to be true. However, it must be noted to the world that deep inside this very mind of subjective power, the very visions, thoughts, memories, and images within this intellect were not in themselves pessimistic, evil, or foremost. However, it is this very deep and profoundly soul-searching kind of depth that inadvertently led my face's contours and lines to take the shape and form of an evil and pessimistic countenance, whereas in reality the appearance of this face, in public settings however, was determined by nothing more than a kind of deep thought. However, in initial response to this facial form and structure, by the very objective and manifest world of humanity, in all of its beliefs, opinions, values, and maxims, etc., the very evil appearance and outlook on my countenance seemed met, on the other hand, by a kind of almost shocked, denied, repulsed, and embittered formation, wherein it is this responsive outlook on the opposing part of humanity that is consequently and inevitably filled more or less with hatred, pessimism, and opposition in regard to my own character, and that the deep thought that was ever so made clear in truth on my side of the spectrum seemed not found whatsoever on the external side of the spectrum, and then it is here in this dialectical relationship between the subject that I am and the object that they are, where all understanding seems to become futile, and the once positive, hopeful, and yet deep thinking insight manifesting the appearance of this countenance became wholly altered and transformed, not physically, for the facial construction was already made negatively apparent to the other side of in this world, but that internally, intrinsically, mentally, and spiritually, the very thoughts and intellect in this mind now became troublesome and hateful. It must be noted that in the end of all this suffering, the ideas of this, as it is shown and proven before me, is nothing more than a deception, a false lie, and a manifest mistake, on my part especially, for we, as both I the subject and you, or they as the object, participate together in a kind of harmony within the nature of the world, and within its moral or immoral powers, and within its will. However, it is on this part that I had for a very long time in my history not recognized, made known, clear, or understood, that the very reason and need for the world's perception and outlook to appear so morbid, uncannily, and disillusioned was not for reasons in themselves, but it was for the very reason, wherever this subject made its manifest appearance within this world, that the very frown, scowl, and seemingly embittered pessimism, showing itself and objectifying itself onto my face and its very countenance, was making itself known and visibly evident among many large and multitudinous amounts of groups, herds, or hordes of human subjects, so that, in turn, we both together fell into a more gruesome state, both together altered and transformed pessimistically, or however evil a degree of feeling or thought made its mark, and that it was my very mistaken, my very blind perception of other fellow human organisms that I felt and thought mankind first appear harsh, severe, and depressed, that it would be the ones outside in the external world of my own, that my pessimistic response to them was simply only a reaction to their outlooks. This is where, in turn, I was wrong, for in fact, the whole outlook of my world was turning pessimistic, altering its course, mistakenly, downward into a pit of hell-fire and slavish pandemonium, for I couldn't understand that the world, as harsh and grotesque as it was to me, was also, on the other hand, and in actuality too, a soft and delicate, beautiful and fertile kind of world. But to me, it was the very hardship and ongoing struggle, ultimately because of this very deep thought and resulting pessimistic outlook and countenance, that shaped and formed my world as it was in its harsh and terrifying gradation, degree, and state. It was for this very reason that I looked into harder, more punishing lifestyles, that I researched very powerful and greatly into noble human beings, historical settings that were evaporated and demystified from struggle, pain, and suffering, for I was becoming rather tired of it, the pain and agony of a tormented, lost, damned, and sinful self. But everything apparent to my life was gradually becoming grim and bitter, and ultimately where my empirical character, as it was formed and made manifest into this world, had begun altering its form and shape in accordance and guidelines to many various principles and values, ones that clarified and ratified all this thought, ones that gave positive direction to my soul alone, the things that made understandable to myself in this world this very spirit. It was all stated and summoned before me, the very purpose to comprehend everything that was happening to me within my world, proceedingly and developmentally. Could it be that if it were not for the very pessimistic appearance of this countenance, wherein its initial setting, with all its misunderstood notions and directions to take from the glimpses and responsive scowls from other people, and the resulting lamentable outlook on the state of things within my world, that the frowns and scowls on my part were to become understood by none other than a kind of deep insight, a foreshadowing concern, a memorable understanding, and a careful intention to create a positive construction within this world, that the pain and suffering I were to inevitably and historically undergo, in a posterior experience and unalterable determination, would therefore not ever to have happened, would it not ever to have occurred or commenced, if I were only to earlier on have justified and made understood my reasons to scowl menacingly at my world in a more positive and benevolent means, that perhaps the very unalterable and determined course of my character would never have happened to undergo such a cruel and inhuman submission to torments, put through by both internal and exterior subjectivity, wherein all subjective procreation, procession, and development deeply within would not have necessitated the deed to commit to and submit to such an abhorrent and damnable Weltanschauung, and that were perhaps by time and aim through history, that by August of 2006 would my character in its formidable degree and grade of cruelty not have the need ever to have become so severe, that perhaps the recognition of myself, my life, and my character as something negative would not have come about, that the possibility and inevitable determination of myself to cause into question and doubt all the world, the meaningfulness of it, and my entire character, to have receded it back into itself and submitted to the hand of the undesirable, tricky, poisonous, sorcerous, and ultimately witch-like state of the slave moralist, in the end to have caused myself, in a state of desperate insanity and overdone mysticism, benevolence, probably not even for the most part genuine, to drop out entirely of academic study and literal discourse, to voluntarily and forcibly terminate myself from the very needed employment position that I had acquired with and was under the possession of at the time, that no ultimately benevolent, charitable, no ultimately deceiving and lying state and condition of myself in my history would ever have needed to occur, and that the notion and possibility of a continued and preserved success and victory within my world, in an ever the more positive, however naive perception of it, that this would have inevitably needed to occur. And most significantly would all these ideas of reference with the world and toward myself, the very delusional, empty, and despairing state that ultimately was to become of me, would not have needed to happen, and however ignorant and undeveloped would the end of this life and spirit in its succession come to be, would the tragic pessimism and negative severity not have necessarily proceeded to develop itself into such a towering state, that, albeit in vain foolishness, would I have committed to and aimed toward the end to a longer life, one more full of happiness, of success, and of victory, positioned above the head from the immortal slave moralist, the very calling upon to recede myself from them, where I would not ever of necessity entertain a doubt within my mind, not to accidentally and needlessly have caused the downfall and ultimate humiliation of my very character within the world and throughout it, and in the end the happiness, joy, wealth, and victory would reassuringly have established itself more prominently enough, that I, as a subject to the very representation and knowledge of this world, would, through a state and condition of health, of wealth, and of abundance, win the life I inevitably determined into, experienced and mastered myself within and throughout accordingly. October 16, 2010. Eleven three 2010. Vanishing walls before forgotten entranceways into relatively deeper dimensions of outer reflective space and eternal frontiers. Upon returning closer to the sensitive states of subjective perception, before the final statement, flowers of lily and rose petites upon the summer shining tower, the upper hemispheres of abundant intellect, observations within universal generation, darkest scaffolds and deepest layers of molecular chasms, silence and fortitude within influxive ice cascades in mercurial condition, a universal eternity of studious intelligence, gazing at a perception ever the more closely, mirrors of glass, infinitesimal portals and gateways to material annihilation and infernal chaos, utmost positive and knowledgeable wilderness within objectified nature, all this through the sensitive degrees of universal inquisitive powers, steel staves and rise of pillars, raised before these reflective portals, thrown into natural and chaotic conditions, frantic screams and storming abysses of satanic hysterical rites, upon the purpose and true reason to protect and preserve, among the many various violences, the very will of the absolute manifest subject, and the intentions to finish a life's work before rising toward the heavens, power of the will and strengthening of fortitude, a stationary lack of trust toward the right direction of the subjective perception in original sensation, a box, square, or timeless house, dark, enchanting physical nothingness, and a curious source toward mental inquisition. As though the universe were without meaning, however, never would it doubt the everlasting affection of causality in its karma, returning ever more deeply into darker, bluest oceans of manifest subjective knowledge, rational intellect, and spiritual objectification, striving toward causes of profound effects, relinquish and nullify the total burning rains and confusing frontal pains of cerebral lobes when, within the stereotypical arrival of pure substance, a questioning, loose adjustment, and encapsulate architecture toward ethereal knowledge, glimpses upward in a quickness and prolific capability, an appearance before the sensation, a color of orange, a round spherical form, accompanied by more obscure shades of purple upon the right-hand path of the representation, faint mysteries behind the craftsmanship of the molecular determined individuations, subject to extreme fluctuation and decadent crusades of darkest inconceivable time, perceptions further above into noble divisions, revelations of human texts, thousands of various concepts and scientific thoughts thrown helplessly together in a state of disorganization and maximum inopportunist decrees. As the current becomes clear, everything suddenly arrives. The absolute futility and impossibility in comprehending philosophically anything that the representative subject within the very universe may strive for in its given capability to perception, Although there exist certain thoughts that proceed further and bear the stamp of great struggling, yet albeit minuscule success, the darkness of extreme abundance lies outwardly and externally from the particular molecular subject, striving towards absolute expression while within an encapsulative and near all encompassing procession downfall of excessive genius and once ecstatic impulse, the darkness and silence of everything, a credit of peace from everlasting suffering, an eldest expectation of deliverance from blistering and sore confusion. The will becomes older, the chain of causality tremors, soaring high above in the mutest titanical transformation of intellect, almost completely blackened from the natural cycle and metaphysical course of the subject's saddened destiny yet renunciatory fate. Sentences that speak of tragedy, a profound knowledge of love and death, especially death, perceive nothing further of material forgetfulness and spiritual nihilism, this in favor of unknown chance mysteries and impossible deifications of mortal intellects. Perhaps the curious, ponderous state of redemption takes shape and form during the final few manifestations and molecular sentences of its subject into the cosmic, natural willing, eternal and everlasting universal abyss. The manifest subjections is summoned into highest and most refined degrees and gradations of renunciatory, resignatory, inspiration, and comatose comprehension. November 3, 2010. (11/5/2010). It is rather interesting to notice the very relativity and relation of everything within this world to a particular spiritual subject of knowledge. I feel at times there is a stronger need to become subjective. I ask myself this, sometimes more or less. I feel as though the entire world and every living and organic thing or object throughout it could appear rather entirely in reference to the substantial essence that is of my very will and its spiritual energy, made affected from what appears to me a hidden and concealed God or Creator, one that at times seems to put into me a purely intellectual, truly mind-spirited will, something manifesting life and desire directly from within the vast tunnels and corridors of my very brain. There is a profound relativity of every object and everything made manifest, summoned and sourced back into the subject itself, that more and more, throughout the studies of my time, appears to be as myself. Certain things in this existence of spirit of mine call out unto me, hearken unto me specific hints and clues that the whole of this world in the spatial universe is not so impersonal, massive, and irrelevant to me as I am, as it could be. When I hear of, read about the history of Adam, I at once immediately sense and perceive and recognize a reference to myself, that the concern and interest of his character through legend, how great the reason it truly is that makes itself to me, that especially it is so when I will approach the subject matter at hand from afar and recognize it from a distance. For quite a time I had recognized rather profoundly during some moments that how every concept and logistical idea in a word or letter bears and deserves its mark and designation in regard to those four classical elements, that over time it has, for me, become so relevant, real, and personal in its prolonging course through my studies. The Hebrew concepts, Adam and his fall in specific, a resurrection of desire to paradise, the fall in particular, that in and of itself appears to have grown and taken determined shape of an experience after the real fall of Adam had occurred back in the historical timeline in reference to me, August or throughout October of 2006. It is that afterward I have uncovered and understood more the notion that everything within this world appears and manifests itself accordingly within a free opportunity and liberated spirit, if under the condition that this objectification of will occurs within my brain undetermined, unaltered, unformed, and unconscious, purely new and indefinite in experience. When a new idea grows accustomed to the rigor of routine and hard determinism, it is that this objectification of will and must, by nature and logical law, become formed, determined, and destined from its idea, so that while upon reviewing it or thinking of it or recognizing it, that idea, it must again appear by rule and objectify itself through natural law in the same way as it had done so the other time, in a hard, similar, natural routine. This, of course, does not negate or nullify the very truthful notion of it ever willing in a state of change and becoming. Of course, this is not referred, though this general idea, as it is during the moment of reflection and general recognition, must and should remain bound and determined logically through its experienced and objectified course of the phenomenon. November 5, 2010. 11/6/2010. In reference to everything internal, deep within the spiritual subject, Very much had occurred and taken shape and formed the vast degrees of my character. Sometimes, given the daily circumstances and manifest routine of my living state and its condition, there is a marked grade of lonesomeness and solitary helplessness, even after a varying level of communication with other intelligible life forms has taken its place. So much has happened, so much has occurred, deep within. Hardly any one in my hour to this day knows well enough and is familiar to the state and condition that is within and about me. I have this persistent urge to write down whatever I am capable of doing so, the thoughts and ideas that manage to progress and develop the seed, stem, branch, and fruit, that can lend to and afford the credible degree of my official government and stateliness, as such a thing makes manifest and summoned about throughout my character in its very sensible degree. I returned to my high school, well after my nature in its given state had more than such managed to alter, very sharply, and adjust the thoughts and concepts, given the great and profound experience I had endured beforehand, within my age and youth that by chance or fate appeared to exhibit extraordinary ideas and abnormal amounts of stress, rigor, and discipline. I had read more into the notion that at times certain characters within this world managed to adjust to and adapt within the mechanisms of defense and ego shelterings in various degrees of differential perspective. Perhaps to other subjects, if they were to undergo endure the experiences of my youth, given within their characters, yet within my history, there would exist a great chance and opportunity of the resulting end that such different characters would come out from the experience in history, adapted and adjusted to it, and developed and progressed in their behavioral minds, in possibly very radical and different forms and methods of resulting type. That I believe, or rather am convinced, that my character, as I myself, had come about and resulted from the experiences, adjusted and adapted to it all in a very sensitive, sharp, nervous, and intelligent degree, that various given motives spurred my thoughts into action, if they are even very subtle, or sharply powerful, and so on. It is that sensitivity and nervousness of my character, the resulting experiences propounded throughout my history in the course of my nature, that had gradually and inevitably shaped and formed my character as it is to this day, in such, although a conceited conviction, a unique, strange, profound, and ineffable type and kind of affluence, affection, and intelligence. I feel convinced of the idea that underneath the whole blistering confusion of striving to organize and rationally categorize the bane of my existence, it is that soon above it all is the stamp and hallmark designation of my character, spiritually considered and conceived of as genius, a lone, solitary, and isolated genius of rare kind. For it appears that very little outside external influences that are within my sight, physically speaking, throughout the region and territory of my local position, project hardly any inspiration, possibility to progress, to enlighten the train of my thoughts, and so on. This genius that is deep within calls to necessity the need to research thoroughly the vast infinite concepts and ideas that are embedded, dormant, and lying within, determined to become discovered, evidenced, and expounded when the opportunity lies before me. I was always very sensitive in regard to everything made understood and perceived by me. I recognized, albeit subconsciously at first, the very endless and eternal relation and relativity of everything within this world, and the reason and purpose for its all making its phenomenal, subconsciously ideal appearance and sensation before me. I feel as though I fell from the Garden of Eden, unrehearsed, relentlessly, and without preparation. Perhaps the recovery I have been making from that procession is forming me and constructing me once again to becoming a much greater and stronger character than in the past. I prefer to look deeply into things. The future lays a hold upon my stress, pains, and troubles. I don't intend to wither it away either. Not to begin ultimately or endlessly placing importance and significance in the minuscule presence or of faculties only the kinds of animals and subjects of ordinary human nature are at most capable of undergoing and proceeding through. The past, likewise, to me, is by necessity upright and conceived within my mind, for this importance appears tantamount to a healthy experience, and drawing out of it into examples and instructions that guide my method and sway my sword into the right skillful cut. I was possibly, before the fall, fully and completely tempted by the snake upon that tree of knowledge of good and evil. It was only a matter of chance and of time that my Lord, God, and Creator would expel me from the paradise I was locked safely and securely once within. Now that I am exiled from that state of bliss and fortune, it appeared before me the purpose and reason to renounce and resign from the whole system and course of things that had at once before preoccupied and influenced my mind, to things in favor of the detachedness from the separation and isolation of those very things, which on one hand had led to many perspectives, opinions, and biases, both upon the right-hand path and upon the left-hand path, that nevertheless scored for me many various throngs or hordes of human subjects, that through and through gave way to me a more satisfactory sociable state of mind, but nevertheless was the internal state, at that time, prior to August of 2006, very replete with stress, pain, and suffering, for there seemingly the whole process of the past, and for seemingly the whole possibility of the future, in regard to the state and condition that I was in, had taken hold and possessed of me and my thoughts, and was guiding my mind through principles and ethics that hardly no one, especially throughout my physical territorial world, had any capability or influence in will, powerful enough to create a partnership or companionship with the likes of me and my character. It is strange, in fact, how there once existed, through a chance reception, yet an outwardly perceiving fate, a personable human subject that I came across and learned to experience with, this person that resembled very deeply and nobly the very state of pain and suffering, hitherto threshold of madness and insanity, that designated and reformed my character as it was in those formidable days of the Aeon, just prior to the downfall and thoroughly beginning resignation of my character in its spiritual life, August of 2006. In a thorough and seemingly complete procession of transformation and changing alteration of youth into adulthood, from sin into blessing, from Satan or the first Adam into Christ, etc., growing all too weary of the endless and ineffable concerns and interests I had appertained into custom and grew forever into this world. There was not a change going to take place under my will. I recognized this so totally, and there became resigned to carry my remaining efforts onto the level and threshold of death, denial, and eternal rest. In any event, it is almost as if the entire past intelligence and state of mind at the time had become forgotten, was lost in the well abyss of eternity, and put to rest, in extinguishment and annihilation of all that remained within this ever so deeply suffering, confusing, and striving desire to encapsulate and engulf the vast root and seed of my once bustling empire and its existence, now all but ruins, and in a decayed innocence, giving hope and faith to release and depart the completion of all the sin, decadence, and infernal activity that once was to have occurred within this mortal soul of seemingly everlasting hell. But nothing is forever eternal. November 6, 2010. (12/3/2010). Escape from Skull Castle, September 30, 2010. Feeling absolutely amazed and mystified right now at the reason and purpose for everything in life. How could it possibly be any more blind, delicate, yet fully unique? A near-complete system given to the subject with such little capability for it to totally become understood, in a state of humility to itself, whatever and wherever it is to be found. October 14, 2010. Pretty epic day on the battlefield. Palmer College hiking trails, beautifully nostalgic sunset, gorgeous cold yet light scenery. A video was made of the day, as though it were November 2006 all over again. I love this weather. October 22, 2010. Palmer Mountain might be just a glimpse of what is to come. Enter darker abysses. October 23, 2010. A near complete preliminary destruction of character and world ambitious direction. Was it deserved? Do I return, or just let it be? October 28, 2010. Pure Artistry Conception Parts 1 and 2 recorded. October 29, 2010. Had a pretty wonderful time filming today at Lake Hodges. There are many YouTube videos I have in mind to come. I wonder if I'm a skilled filmmaker. I hadn't thought about this idea so much, though there's definitely great sources of inspiration. October 31, 2010. Had a good time recording and filming myself on the piano at the college practice rooms today. A Vorspiel, 2 Mendelssohn songs, even a Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody piece, something I ordinarily wouldn't touch on for some time. All in all, the work is done, and the pleasure of the day's art remains in reach to perceive. November 2, 2010. Went to the grocery store thinking about buying a drink, something rather unusual for me. Bought some sweets instead, only to return home, watch an Iron Chef episode where the challenger's master drinks heavily and is utterly intoxicated, as though it's a kind of punishment for me denying my will tonight. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that this world is just a dream commanded and determined by my will alone. November 6, 2010. Currently in the process of transferring all the blog material all the blog information and material to another site, probably Blogspot, after witnessing the seemingly total annihilation and foremost destruction that MySpace has unfortunately issued and done so to their blog system and its once almost ideal atmosphere and subjective aura it contained. What an utter mess and sad disappointment it has become for me. November 10, 2010. Unfortunately, MySpace developed so much history to it. The old archaic messages documenting specific times my character was transforming from its youth into early adulthood. The seemingly mystical writings that were presented for the time being. Such things likely will never happen again for me. I think rather it's time to move on, literally and truthfully, start a completely new chapter somewhere else, as the genuine moments for me lasted around 4 complete years, late 2006 to late 2010, and were becoming so old and extinguished. So yes, a place like Blogger or Live Journal looks pretty positive currently. November 10, 2010. My thoughts may have been directed in the manner of a noble lie for quite some time. The effects, negative and very hard to see at first, made their appearance. The causality of it all begins punishing my person for succumbing so deeply to those dishonest deceptions coming from the external world, this slave-driven morality. November 11, 2010. Well, this is good. The complete text to the first book, The Birth of the Fool 1, is transferred almost in total to another blog website at blogspot.com. Doing this was rather sufferable. No spaces between paragraphs. Photos are overcropped, though it is finished, and I think I have a genuine patience for many things now that this is over. November 13, 2010. This is great. The second book is on the web now, in a much more presentable form, transferred from pitiful MySpace HTML to a site with much better standard, I think. New writings should continue from this website from now on. So long, MySpace. A goodbye to all the frustrations and disappointments while there. Shouldn't miss it much, though. November 14, 2010. So it appears now Big Bear is a likely possibility to relocate and situate in. I'm aiming high for it this time. Wonder what fantastic and strange tales this could potentially bring to me. Somehow high aloft in the mountain air, completing another discourse. Feeling rather unusually optimistic right now. November 17, 2010. The apartment that I checked out 2 days ago in Big Bear feels so comfortable and ideal. It is spacious, a good quality and affordable. Now only to get a job around the place where I moved in, the social requirement will be set. Not any isolatory, solitary suffering this time, plus benefits and a job together is ever so lucrative. November 21, 2010. Heading up to Big Bear once again tomorrow in search of a nice apartment. There are 2 affordable and somewhat ideal apartments that I have in mind. Should dress warmer this time. Hope for good road conditions. November 28, 2010. Perhaps the symbolism of everything around me is calling for me to become a chef. If I'm ever to enter the workforce again, what could this continual viewing of Iron Chef mean? What, the only channel I'll watch on the television is Food Network? Anthony Bourdain in his Food Chronicles as the occasional exception? November 30, 2010. There seems a relativity and connection, I cannot deny it, that these shows and such could represent a reflection of my future position, which I feel resonates harmoniously inside of me, that there exists the positive suggestions and clues of what vocation to take as the preparation ready for myself to enter back into the workforce takes form. Lately, more ideas of this nature are appearing in an obscure relation to my will that might very well be calling upon me to choose this position as an option made available and accessible to my talent and skill. I feel I have begun to possess a deep connection and understanding of my creator or will, and an abundance of things and their meaning fall into agreement rather easily with these such thoughts and reflections. November 30, 2010. Christianity asserts all these claims of miracles and supernal powers made manifest once in the material earth. There's no grounds or evidence for it, so they can only rely on belief, trust, faith to give their God any credibility. They act as though they possess the answer, though on the other hand, with philosophers, researchers, scientists, etc., we stand in the position of ambiguity and doubt with regard to any knowledge that might belong to Christianity and such. So really, the only knowledge we accept are the things that are purely and categorically evident through experience, impossible to defend. Maybe physics and such has advanced to a certain extent, though all the progress from ancient times to modern times is rather superfluous and can be perceived in such a way that it is merely a support and material proof of all the knowledge the ancients of antiquity once contained. It could be possible, too, that the earth is not the sole bearer of life. Everything in the world belongs to the subject that is capable of affirming the I am, like me or you, for example, and that everything in this world is made manifest and appears out of the will of the subject, depends on this subject, and is relinquished and erased once the subject ever ceases or falls away. Like, for instance, looking deeply into everything, it becomes known that the world is no more real than a dream. When driving around in a car, other cars pass by in symbolic reflection in regard to your will, like a red car comes by because your will is willing red, harshness, severity, the planet Mars, etc. Everything is manifest and summoned, upheld and supported by this will alone. The will keeps willing too. And once the subject is deceased, here it is when still willing upon death, that the life of it returns to the world and comes back again, making its ideal appearance through metempsychosis, reanimation, etc. Everything has a purpose and a reason to it. Every movement the subject makes has a reason. Many of the movements, most of the time, are done subconsciously. I perceived this in the beginning rather very tragically, actually. I believe one of the few reasons man has that need to philosophize is because one day he will experience death, which is inevitable. Nothing but matter is eternal, really. Perhaps even matter is not eternal. I think with enough spiritual effort and atonement, the world can be forgotten and finished upon the final incarnation of the subject's death, like for instance during a sadhu or yogi's life, an ascetically disciplined religious guru somewhere in India. Everything is one. Everything apparent is in the womb, or in the hand of the Creator. It's like, for instance, looking into, gazing, and peering into a crystal ball with our hands. That perception belongs to the Creator God, and the images and fantasies inside that ball are us, within this universe. I've become rather convinced that the Platonic ideas behind everything in this deceptive world belong to the thought, reflections, and knowledge of our Creator, that the subject enters into this world as game or scheme, really. I think we, or I, am from some strange marble hall, and before birth I'm standing before the Creator, or rather the Father, and he and I discuss and review all the things my life is about to unfold. Then he sends me into this world in mysterious ways. And then I live my life, die, and then return to the Father, or Lord, etc. He and I review the amount of suffering I endured, the amount of atonement and forgiveness I assumed, and if it is not entirely adequate or sufficient for the Lord, then he sends me back into the world to try and apologize for my life, the ground and the reasons to live once again. As it is becoming clearer now, it is true that I am very strongly convinced and hardly determined by the notion or idea of reincarnation, or rather, as I refer to it, metempsychosis or palingenesis. Knowing this world as nothing more than an illusion or scheme, and thence becoming convinced by this, can bring about initially a state of despair, because it is such a lonely world now being looked at in such a way. In fact, it is ever so true, every ancient culture, including remote tribes even, believe in it. All religions, civilizations, etc. had various degrees of this belief, all except for the Yu, with his 3 desert religions. These Yuish religions took the idea that everything is made from nothing, becomes something, then returns to nothing, in between an absolute eternity. So such a thing, when meditated on, brings about a very sharp degree of fear for death, because of the everlasting effects of it, when this thing as such is by no means accurate or justified, when after the undergoing of deeper meditations on life, death, and becoming, etc., but with reanimation, metempsychosis, etc., death is hardly much to fear, because I as a subject will die, but then I as a subject am reborn and conceived once again in the same will as I was right upon my last death, as life appears ever so continual and regulated. I think that upon the death of the subject, all the consciousness and knowledge of it that was learned in the world perishes and becomes nothing, as these things belong to the category of the intellect, which represents the head or brain, but rather whatever energy or spiritual state that the subject is existing at upon the time of his departure into the next world. That state will, or should, be the focal point and starting ground for his next admission, purpose, and reason into his reborn and reconceived state. Since it's kind of like the intellect of the human brain comes about and makes itself manifest through accident, it is necessary to understand that it cannot continue as it became into the next world. But since the will, which is the category opposite of the intellect, since the will is not accidental, but purposive and rational. It is this thing that makes this journey again into the next and following world. An infant dying represents whatever meaning for it that the Creator did not intend it to live long enough. So the infant or fetus, etc., dies quickly and returns to the womb or the halls of the Creator, because perhaps in a previous life that now infant subject once had murdered an infant or aborted a fetus, etc. So in other words, the karma that necessarily follows is to take place in the sequence of that individual's life. The next life is affected by the actions and deeds of this life. Good deeds in this life bring on good intentions and potential for the next life, where bad deeds, etc., bring on bad potential, etc. It is true, it could even be that in our past history of the many successions of our lives, we could have experienced the life and spirit of an extraterrestrial form, or that in what is to become we are about to experience it too. Certainly, in the perspective of an outsider from the Earth as a planet, we would indeed be considered extraterrestrial to other intelligent life forms if it exists. At least human civilizations have been abounding for 5 or 6 something thousand years. Before this, the world was so primal and archetypal, primitive and brutal. It's a rather interesting theory. It is kind of similar to the theories of the star Sirius, that the astronauts from this star system constructed as an experiment human life and dropped humanity off on this Earth several thousand years ago, and that there were explosions in the Earth to move the planet into an adequate orbit with the Sun, hence the Sahara Desert and glass sheets in South America, that initially the astronauts walked upon the Earth with mankind, hence strange cave paintings about images no primitive could have developed on their own, and so on. Blavatsky wrote all about this theory. Her secret doctrine book contains much information about it. I can only imagine something disastrous happening to this world sometime soon. I don't believe the West is going to continue much longer. A couple more decades or something and hell will probably break loose. Law and definition becoming eroded. In place of this is boundless petty self-affirmation and self-love, living disinterest and nihilistic oblivion. November 22, 2010. 12/15/2010. Inevitable licentiousness. Poetical puritanical subsurface. Heretical submission of wounded subject matter. Beyond fallen golden halls of Mithras, thy God, Lord Creator, the becoming necessary radical embracing of malevolent evil, despicable rationality, embittered catastrophe and thorough refutation of benevolent saintliness, incapable of holding back, necessitation of magnum opus renovation, establishment principium, beginning once and twice, ennobled purposiveness upon last maintenance, enervated facial, caribal ganglionical implementation, speak nothing more right before quivering countenance, remembrance of thy cleverest reactionary substantial force, beyond violent foundation of enclosed walls and internal regulation. Doth this not make sense unto thou? Bespeakest thy word, thy spell before thee, thy mucopurulent penitence and slave subjectification, removal of bleakest doubt and denial of usual crucifix misunderstanding. Across these fields of ethereal romanticism and warmest embrace, paramount meeting an ancient antiquarian recitation of cacophonic reason and mystified imperial theoretical chronology, onto this brilliant whitest seat of forbidden ascetical, ever asinine malevolent infernal reciprocation. Beyond chaff of consequential sentiment, we stand before the gateway to nothingness, ain void and absolute spiritual, willing fulfilled annihilation. For does it not matter, not even to commence a credit to everlasting pleasure? What value to implicate that doth not shine everlastingly, eternally, at most near total regal government, multifarious, tumultuous, sovereign agency, ultimacy? One word standeth before that existential form and life-house sentence. Being no longer self-realized, we enter into shapeless crypts, spiritual deficiency, weak funeral, death, decomposition, legionary emasculate butchery sent below to thy tomb of troublesome trial and awful awakening, restoration into post-monumental affliction, attendance of mutest staff, behold the desire of thy aged philosophical emperor, tyrannical reformation beyond evermore truest enchantment, forgotten symbolical representation of cruelest, darkest madness deep inside phenomenal oceanic despotism, return to the sanctuary for sake of sanitary restoration and solar redemption. We fall continuously into harder determinable sin, ephemeral limitation of Kaiser-like prayer, in foremost desperation, as has become universal knowledge. The grand ultimate situation inside further loosening nerves and cortexual ossification, tragical futility and bleakest retirements of fallen imperators, into palace sanctus sanctum blackest shades, be drawn forthwith thy sin. Hold back nothing more than merciful tears and prostrate surgical refulgence, fallen back and induced into final declamation of mythical legendary dreams, and strange-like fantasies of pucks and fairies, jagged-tooth rites and witch-like tricks, remembrance of denial, thy noblest preliminary self-abortion, human flesh turns cold, forsaken rendering of thy heart. Thy mind, deceased and immobilized, yet somehow still intact, in comatose, icy, and frostbitten condition of intellectual affirmation, the death of puny souls met by thousands once crowding everywhere, yet never again realistically perceived or diametrically assimilated, imperative categorical return into the crypts of death and coffin dust by forsaken killing of what was tyrannically becoming incomprehensible, enormously lost and chaotically fallen out of symmetrical proportion, rational balance, angelic control, and temperamental fiery selfish esteem, post-influential bionical rabbinical demarcation upon head of anti-Christian dogmatism, yet never to the purest. Also withstand thy forbidden occultic doctrine, thy presidential codification of ideographical paradox. We say nothing more. We stand beside lost realms and foggy dimension of ethereal nothingness and void confusion of dreamlike phantom souls. We are the ones of Keter. We make us to thee before thy crown. Once was I given the form of thy mother, nevermore was I given the form of thy father. Fallen and lost confusion to state and grievance of absolute self-annihilation, and spiritual white shining brilliant delineation of Hebraic mystical totalistic illumination, while still inside somewhat deep eccentrical spherical emanation of divine tall, fine tree-like life in almost seemingly impossible state and condition of phenomenal, imaginary particular will. December 15, 2010. 12/16/2010. I understand in regard to me the unusual kind of difficulty, struggling, and suffering that I had needed to endure and experience while growing up and maturing from a state of youthhood into that of a young adult. Every situation and environments that I stationed within and underwent throughout certain specific ages and aeons within the youth of my character contained the seeds and origins to impending frustration, visceral doom, and abundant confusion. By the age of 12, it already was becoming apparent to me that the familial circumstances and the chance scenarios within my schooling, my social life, etc., all did in fact contain these very preparations that grew, developed, and eventually created a kind of state that was initially and totally obtained by my age of 19, where it appears that my juvenile aeons of youth finally were becoming done, and an incessant decline and failure of health, vigor, form, action, and direction, and so on, were taking form and becoming commonplace for me. During these very initial days of my early youth, I possessed it well within me to become rather severely depressed, clinically so, or otherwise very unstable, and acts of self-mutilation, half-hearted rebelliousness, and suicidal ideations were becoming regular. In a state of climax as the condition had inevitably reached, I consequently was thrown into several mental institutions in promises of becoming healthier, more stable, happier, and further sane. It seems to me that throughout the course of my life thus far, there had always the way been this impending difficulty to find for myself a resort to restore into simpler habitats that was freed and cut off from all these troublesome and seemingly accidental circumstances that were beginning incessantly to plague the dominion of my very life. Because of this tragic realization, it became clear that in order to survive, it would become necessary to adopt, and alter the state and condition of my biological and inborn immediate character to suit the desperate needs that were abounding everywhere within my life at the time. In other words, by the time I was ready and prepared to return to the only option of a home I once had, by the time I was 14, 15 years of age, the intellectual nature of my character was becoming changed, transformed, almost very radically, as I did not intend to ever return to these environments of medicine and laboratorial concentration, of severe pain and torment, that it was this radical change and alteration of my form and character that necessitated the realization that my life, story, and legacy was one of excessive hardship, struggle, and suffering. I knew by this time, that is, by around the years of 14 and 15, that my life, even thus far as it had minutely proceeded, and also taking into account the impending progression that was to come, was something terrible, something brutal and crucial, but the spiritual reason and purpose for this suffering was not to be understood, comprehended, or figured out in my life up to this point in time. In other words, I returned for the first time, rather lately for my age, to the public high school within my living vicinity, and the feelings and sentiments I needed to express were tantamount in equilibrium in proportion to the very state of mind I was becoming swallowed within. In regard to the terrible past I had endured, even as yet, and was likely going to follow through, the reason for these terrible things being experienced were becoming clearer by now. It seems that the terrible character of mind that became evident and visible to the world in its expression was something that later in my life was going to reciprocatively cause massive attack, scorn, and fastidiousness onto my very own self, for that very expression and representation I had developed and advanced within was something terribly bad, truthfully, and necessitated certain peculiar bad effects in reaction upon the part of me. It also seems that everything now proceeding much later into my youth, the end of its days, that is, 19 years of age, was still unimproved. The struggles, hardships, turmoils, aches, and pains were existing, still remaining within the dimensions of my own person. That, in fact, the bad, punishing causality continued and progressed ever the more worse. It was inevitably culminating in something gigantic and terrible for me, as all of these circumstances that were plaguing my life beforehand were still, in their own way, finding their means to manifest themselves and make the statement that my will needed for these very awful and painful things to begin with, for some kind of karmatic consequential purposes that initially began and took place in some earlier unknowable life were in connection with my spirits. I found ways to adapt to my pain, once again, some new means that I hadn't attempted beforehand. Looking back during this age of 19, it was something stoic and internal that developed within my character, something obscure, religious, and poetic, that inevitably needed to come about as a result of a grueling quality and manner of distress, rigor, and routine that possessed the very spirit of my own and damaged it to the point of utter insanity, chaos, and disillusion. That this in itself was one of the things coming about within my state of character. A strange sense of disillusionment, not known to me before in my life, was finally taking shape and altering the construction and establishment of every one of my principles, values, morals, and ethical decisions. It seems that it was by this point that this shell mentality of hardness, brutality, cynical pessimism, and tyrannical force, the one that gave birth to and was conceived as a direct result of returning to that hellish familial scenario immediately after the time of the hospitalizations and medical treatments, in order to adapt to and cope with the same terrible substances that, naturally and purely speaking, would lead my character again and again back into a state of major clinical depression and suicidal ideation. It was this masculine mentality of coarseness that developed and advanced. Like that earlier depression, in its advancement and coming ruin, alteration and transformation, the coarseness developed itself to an extreme limit, faced injury, hilarity, and ridiculousness by its extreme measure, necessitated the need for it to alter and change, transform and free itself from the throes of subjective dominion that was eventually coming to bring about, yet again, a state of madness and despair, yet that it was this time that the ultimate spastic action on its part would have been the action of committing a homicide instead of a suicide, inside its very state of mind, and finally landing my position in a state of penitentiary and imprisonment, thus naturally rendering all or any success, fortune, abundance, wealth, health, happiness, or victory impossible and sterile in order to achieve any time during this lifetime of mine. So, in effect, the kind of almost religious change that took its place by the age of 19 was one consisting of stoical thought, religious and spiritual insight, internal relocation, natural isolation from distressing habitats, and an inevitable return to a kind of state of nothingness, and that of nothing to begin with, as it was becoming so evident by now that my life was indeed what was needing such an exact and profound change from the cataclysmic, myopic insanity that this previous shell mentality had led itself into. That culminating state, an individual and human expression and reflection of that ancient Roman Empire, its very harshness and red severity, and its inevitable downfall and end, probably caused and brought about precisely by the same means that I had directed to bring down my state of empire, that one means I refer to as doubt and reflection, looking back upon everything with a concern and questioning that was it ever fair, just, or good enough to settle upon or to further develop it dramatically. Naturally, as it was coming to be, what occurred inside of me at this time was a radical change and alteration of form and character, from one kind, that of a powerful and profound master morality, to a new inclusion and lending of an ear toward a ass-slave morality, listening well enough to that very reactionary, improbable side in order to make any necessary amends and improvements that would form better a construction and state or condition of my character in its very natural need to expression and artistic representation. In other words, I didn't intend to become negated anymore, as any further negation just before this time would lead to a physical, real, and brutal disaster or conflict among whatever chance or fated subjection that came along the way in the picture of my life, and felt or thought sentimentally offended or insulted by those very past expressions, words, or thoughts that were crazily spewing from my mouth during those highly active and well-distressed times. It is strange. It was this very doubt of my character, and the very listening of myself to that of the other side of the spectrum, for the very first few times, to that of the slave moralist, that eventually tore down the walls of all my defensive hardness, later created a new character of my own, one finally existing in harmony with the world, or at least attempting, rather very clumsily and poorly, to situate and exist in harmony and balance with this world, as it was such a new thing for me, and something that of which I had little to no experience, to that of executing such a kind of intention, precisely or humbly. It is as though that by eradicating and evacuating all and any of the remaining harsh sentiments of my more recent past, I in effect created a new character almost out of nothing, was then someone finally with a more charitable, noble, and agreeable personality. I started with my life with something new. There manifest were original ideas and fresh intentions. I desired to look and perceive as at everyone and everything in this world with not such an instantly disagreeable, pessimistic, and hopeless reaction, as this behavior and state of mind had become the norm in the more previous state of my character, one that almost by necessity I needed to change and to steer away from, for any sake of my health, safety, security, wellness of my own living being. Now, as the change was finally starting to form and make effect, the various expressions and intentions to project and receive any recognition with others were altered in their means to whatever ends likewise. During this time in my life, around October of 2006, it became rather difficult to speak about and describe accurately even more, for the spirituality of my own at this time was so rather obscure and vague. Nevertheless, to summarize more effectively, it was this very new, fresh, and original character that in fact was still hanging on to and remembering the sentiments and rationalities of that elder evil empire of the past. It was likewise resorting to expressions and representations, taking into consideration the morality and virtues of the very slaves of this world of mine, so that in combination these two radically different and ultimately opposite mentalities, and whereas I somehow had come about to represent the both of these, visible to others, at virtually the same time, it was in effect something that drew over time more and more severe reactions and confused retorts from these very others, for this newer, more confused behavior of mine was something rather odd of a case, and likewise likely found and possessed within the kind of individuals that only madman, evil geniuses, or insane fanatics would come about to, and so the categorical effect drawn for the others onto my now confused state of spirit created and eventually landed onto me these very labels, lists, names, negations, and dismissals that I initially proposed to steer away from directly in so desperate and necessarily overdone a measure. That is to draw away myself from that ruthless empirical past, and from the labeling, negating, and dismissal that the other subjections within my world were coming about to react upon and perform such and such. It was this new, now terrible reality of constant negation and dismissal from others, once again, because of the confusing, perplexive, and probably downright insane behavior of my own, that because of this reality, I necessitated to draw back from and recline into the very dominion of isolation, self-silencing, radical solitude, and virtual stiflement from any contact, source, or association for the very so-called others that seemed no more than now evil slaves within my world that wouldn't so much as even give a chance of my own to attempt a reconciliation and apologetic forgiving forgetfulness of my past to their kind, as it was my well good and likely noble intention to continuously perform and act upon. Yet as this behavior was becoming in vain, and not knowing of any other means to defense from dismissal and foremost negation, it appeared as though it were the end of this life, spirit, and activity of the forsaken name, state, and character of Adam, and were the only means that could assist in victory and triumph of this confused state, would necessitate the introduction of a prolonged and seemingly eternal time. It was, therefore, the reality of profuse isolation and inexplicable sorrow that was by right and duty to follow and succeed, and it seemed that since this very epoch in this very life of mine had discovered boundless, albeit small, trivial, and superficial opportunities to achieve a state of success and happiness, apart from the ever so present need to defend my character from seemingly constant negation and incessant dismissal, from appearing too weird, too eccentric, or creepy to a strange subject, or from becoming too caught up in the moment and happening to unleash a further side of me where to others it might appear too evil, sinister, or cruel to their credibility. That it is true, it seems, with enough time and interest in the attempts to produce tricks and techniques that all should eventually assimilate and accumulate together and create a kind of state of character that no longer needs to consciously and awareingly think about or reflect imaginatively of just how to bring about its existence, to produce a free, natural, and healthy kind of success. So, as it is, that, in other words, if no such accidental injury or chance affliction were to take part for me, my life preeminently, that the eventual return to and restoration of true health, positivity, and happiness might take its place, whereas no need to express a master morality or slave morality would necessarily exist, that a kind of natural, irrelevant, unreflective youthfulness would manifest and appear some time, and gradually would lead my being into a state of true health, sanity, honesty, and victory, and not presuppose any strong desire or need to return to a state of isolation, exile, and seclusion. For the very state of mind I necessarily should experience already proceeds through accordingly and passes to the condition of true adulthood, where not any trace or source of insanity, wickedness, lies, or philosophical confusion any longer plagues or troubles or so severely the core of this true inner being. December 16, 2010. 1/14/2011. First of all and foremost, there are some things that I feel important and significant in my world that ought to, by necessity, become stated. I have become so completely lost, so totally far and distant within such dark, horrible corridors. It is that I do not so much even as possess right now any good enough or powerful enough answer that will clarify and rationalize generally and universally the very painful hardship and evil torments that this fundamental kernel and isolated care of my individual state of existence and being so pertains. If I were not so committed to any kind of alteration or transformation of my current state of character right now, I think that by necessity I would contain the need to understand and comprehend a very tired and exhausted state and nature of my existence, that, removing myself from such a steeled and determined course of possible fates, I would rather settle on a grounded principle, one that is complete and fulfilled with an intelligent, noble, and justifiable intention. I feel as though that I vacillate and deliberate prolongedly between two certain unique states of mind for most of the time. These very states that contain the seed to either a great abundance of madness, or to an indeed great abundance of genius, a kind of intellectual rarity and special discourse of regulated conception. My life, it seems forever to be eternally developing, progressing, and altering into various different unique individual states, one that of which recently is found included in the sentiment and appeal to scholarly impulsation, aspiration, and ambition. Here I find myself long lost in the deep channels and walled corridors of a localized library, situated, gestating feverishly, absorbing the plentiful amounts of information and knowledge within seemingly endless pages of the various books and tomes of wisdom, ranging from Schopenhauerian philosophy, Kantian doctrine, histories in regard to the rise and fall of antiquated empires, ancient Roman, Greeks, and so on, in such Hinduistic inspirations, the Dhammapada from Gautama Buddha, the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, Platonic dialogues and Aristotelian science, Philo-Judaeus and Heraclitus, Herodotus and Empedocles, seems to have become for me a huge source of inspiration and motivated cause, setting forth my ambition aflame at the beginning of each session of study. Some of the various biographies and information regard to Richard Wagner, his life, music, philosophy, and creation, and overall radically genuine and timeless creativity. A rare man that I have come into regard and recognize for now as such, as so great and extraordinary a source of genius and intellect. The more I read into him and about him, the more I then come to feel an insatiable and utterly fated and destined relationship in regard to his life, principles, and values. Early life, youth, and adulthood, abounding in customary reference to optimistic resource, Greek virtue, and affirmative life, and where it so appears that by and through enough time, age, and experience, also with the seemingly chance reference from one of his friends at the time to a philosopher of magnanimous viscosity, that inevitably transformed and had torn down Wagner's latent empire, made reevaluate and redefine his very morals and principles, by cause of which the philosophy of Schopenhauer has so dictated and expressed with a concise and inevitable necessity. all of which this occurrence and constituent action had given forth profound insight and foreknowledge of Wagner in regard to my own self, in association with the very trials, suffering, and the state of everything that Wagner was going through, so very similar in regard to that of my own. Yet, nevertheless, it is with a great regard and indebted gratitude of myself that I hereupon give honor and praise to these very life and death ideals that so afford boundlessly a kind of inspiration that I intend to preserve so much of it as is possible, and not see to it ever to die away. I intend to scour the books and pages of the various great geniuses and philosophers, artists and sages, through the endless tunnels and amazing confines of time and history, to absorb and comprehend all that which is possible to find these very answers, to recall to mind, take credence and saturate this well-being and state of existence, in order to find the very keys and the very secrets that depart away and open forth to more of a blessed, restorative, and abnegated state and condition from seemingly infinite suffering, darkest perplexity, and ratiocinative distress. I must return, ordain, and decree justifiably by degree of necessity that is paramount and requisite to the kind of greatness that is unsurpassed within such life in its confines, while within and undergoing such a current state of visceral affliction and manifold suffering. January 14, 2011. (1/26/2011). A downward spiral, a funeral division from the will, combat and fatigue, battle pains and irreparable wounds, all ultimately relinquished into the arms of death, yet only for the moment. When is it not to be? December 10, 2010. A thousand faces gazed into me tonight, and I into them. Although I was the one in command of my cause, I never wavered my will. December 11, 2010. Reaching the point of no return, so long ago, eventually the cycle comes to an end. We are never to be reborn. So much for the joy and fun as it has lasted. Yet not despoiling various stages within the will, however, though what a mysterious yet fully evocative and inquisitive time of night so far it is to have become. December 31, 2010. Situated deep in a remote library, confounded, exposed to various archaic texts, scriptures, sources of a scholarly nature, studies hour upon hour, week upon week, taking it all within, never to depart from answers or genuine dissolutions, reason becomes refined to sharpest degree of universal knowledge. I'm becoming a philosophical scholar in my own right. January 10, 2011. I've become so inspired and motivated recently to get to the heart of everything philosophical, spiritual, and or religious. So many books and plans I've been envisioning with my artistic ideas, and piano recordings are serving as great support for my ambitions. January 10, 2011. I feel I'm becoming more human as every day in this life of mine is progressed. It must be for the better. It must. January 16, 2011. Recorded and assembled together a pretty interesting video, I think. Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy poem, recited by me, set to stately Baroque music by Handel, and enveloped in Michelangelo's art in his paintings from the Sistine Chapel. January 17, 2011. Going to head over to the college tomorrow, begin practicing there once again, warm up on the piano with emphasis on emotional and heartfelt repertoire. Later this week I should head back to the place, begin recording all these random musical ideas and thoughts I have in mind. Who knows, soon there should be seen to an abundance of original creativity, improvisations and such, all these crazy songs I have in mind. January 17, 2011. Feeling well practiced today while at the college. Definitely met with some pleasant people there. Received also some good compliments. I felt so humbled. Will likely set to record some ideas sooner than later. Who knows, tomorrow even. January 19, 2011. Everything went pretty much according to plan today, thankfully. Was able to bring home a rather decent recording while at the college, albeit ridden with these crazy ideas, melodies and harmonies. Nonetheless, looking forward to doing it again. Fleeting Perceptions, Parts 1 and 2 are on the YouTube account. Enjoy it! January 2011. Tomorrow equals head into the practice rooms for hopefully another good day of improvising and recording music. We'll see what can be made of it this time. January 23, 2011. Thinking about purchasing composing software like Finale or Sibelius, an electronic keyboard, and simply begin orchestrating my own music into the form of dramatic symphonies, editing the improvising acoustics of the recordings from the program, giving them a legitimate sound, and transferring the productions to audio CD or the internet for viewing pleasure. So much might come from this. Can't wait to begin. January 23, 2011. I downloaded MuseScore just a minute ago. It's a free shareware orchestration program. I was toying with some of these musical ideas I have with it. I have so great an amount of plans of what to do with recorded piano improv pieces, but settling down to composition more thoughtfully and reflectively is an idea I've for so long had in mind for me to eventually do. I plan to give much patience to this someday and labor with it, inevitably and consequently. It is something designated and calling for me that I need to pursue. January 23, 2011. I can safely say I've recorded one of the most intense pieces I've done in a while today. The pedal was creaky on the piano I had available, which led to some wild musical thoughts. Throughout the piece, the crazy atonal stuff is scrapped this time in place for a more beautiful aesthetic, albeit intensely chromatic design. January 24, 2011. Was studying many different books at the library today. Just happened to come across a whole Western-oriented volume dedicated to metempsychosis, a subject to which I've grown increasingly indebted to over time. As well, the place just happens to carry Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, a brilliant occult book I've taken an interest to, and now can settle down with to study authentically over time. January 25, 2011. Just assembled together some totally random and ridiculous material I've had in storage from a while back. I really don't take any interest in the character of the content right now, but since I've been meaning to take a break from the heavy nature and serious mood of all these past various works, I decide giving this side of the affairs a try shouldn't hurt. Enjoy it. January 25, 2011. Deeper metaphysical speculations. 2/10/2011. Blankness, stilled streams of conscious fog, a fog of consciousness, one that knows better but knowing not. Internal subjective will. Welcome back. Return into the sanctuary of crystal and coldest twilight labyrinth mazes. Return to that substantial force, the one that derives the will with breathless heart's impulse and felt compassion, though never is it beheld in perpetuity, only in currents of reflective self-abnegation, brought about by thorough meditative foreshadowing and effective essential insight of awareness of an ethereal division and immaculate conception, one that sends thyself into the waves, into the sea that deepens all the more with starkest struggling and harshest suffering that we behold. A representation, prime in its essence, understood by very few, though the reactive response does not matter any more or any further. The message that now appears intuitively, yet so clearly, the world as thy representation, my own soul, ever so solitary and alone, seemingly fixed, a terrible catastrophe rise within the flesh of my soul. I formed only what justified my very will, its need for clarification, grave understanding. Thoughtful silences, mute countenances, when in the world will the wisdom become upheld by the name, state, and legislation of this very subjective universe? It seems all the more troubling to find a kind of restoration and redemption. Nevertheless, we understand the fool that must shine, a brilliant magic in the penultimate end, the chain of causes that ready for disclosure and discontinuance. Tiresome and troubled, the new lie ought not to have become dependent by the hordes or by the person. Though I represent the hierarchical apex, the key and link in between the two radically disparate worlds, thy offspring I can trust not to further continue any kind of knowledge in memory of everything profound and great since come to pass. Thy offspring I continue not in any way, for when we find and establish ourselves permanently freed and abolished from any immemorial life and distress, we do this successfully by the deed and action of a life negation, and discontinuance of seed and germ to spread. Eventually, thy will be done by the eventual return to the noble and virtuous intellect, termination of knowledge and sentence by deed of compassion and kindness, even if preliminarily hastily acquired of knowledge, of knowing, or unready to commit such a mystical grade of profundity. We do not live into the end, regardless if we are to return to a countless number of eyes. The nothingness of the void is inevitable and eternal. The lonely soul returns in the end to the vanishing evaporation of fire and will within spirit. We are the innumerable objective manifestations, pluralistical individuation, however ultimately inseparable in the subjective dimension of our own phenomenal reality. Here before thee, we indeed it so, into the end, before thee, into the end, our lux, our love, our life, we shall become better within time in its restoration. February 10, 2011. 2/12/2011. Visualization. Obscure, distant, yet cooperative within the corners of the knowing eye. Buried the eye deep into the reflection of the conscious mind. Disparate colors in categorical space, varied form and tone within dimensions of matter. Noise, sonic and again varied. Touch and such. The conception of the sensations and its multiple merits made manifest within the mind, yet seemingly external, objectified and rationalized throughout. The body and its will lured deeply into spatial deception. Time succeeds. Transformation and alteration of decadent conduct. Matter and its aeons, aging and dying. Funereal attribution from this reality. Do not fall into the trap. Order and understanding within the universe made paramount. Almost in a perpetually will-less state, becomes ever the more. Upon response, benediction and affirmation, for the purpose of representing a good intention, pure and unadulterated, by necessity it must love, for in the palm of the hand of the great Creator, Lord God, that is outside this universal realm, nothing so petty as a crime or an end in injustice make an everlasting deserving effect. The very crystal reflection that the Lord returns his gaze into makes us ourselves summoned and manifest. By acknowledgement and recognition from this very Creator God, now becomes a tantamount responsibility for his very creation within the scope and playing field of his matter, to act accordingly with his best ability to reason, action, and resolution. Here will appear various subjects within the playing field of his very reflection. Everything within the realm and dimension of his creation matter makes its appearance in accordance to various archetypal and derivative ideas that the Lord has his intentions in mind to proceed upon. Here it becomes rather a confusion for most of the subjects that are bestowed with the capability to think, reason, and to know. Interaction appears between various multitudinous things, or forms of matter, substance rather, that proceed eventually to shape, alter, and transform the nearly infinite forms throughout the great principle of time. The existence and state of shapes, of squares, circles, triangles, etc. remain in effect. The existence and state of various colors remains manifest. Likewise, there remains the ever-succeeding moment within the great principle of time that never departs or contradicts while matter is made manifest here upon this very experimental earth. In addition, neither does there depart from the matter the very cause, effect, change, and transformation that takes place while called upon into this earth its action, with a reference to causality, a cause and effect, a more deeply understood karma. Here appears man historically within the very station and will to life. He seems made first appearance in this history, not by chance or spontaneous action, throwing himself into daylight. Rather, it would seem more likely that his subject has made himself, eventually, apparent within the everlasting changes and causes that bear outside his path no beginning, neither an end. The perspective of this, of everything that is rather empirical, seems materialistic and hollow. Therefore, it would be by necessity be inevitably called into question by more spiritual, celestial, and mystical side, the subjective side of the spectrum. As a rule, there must be understood first and foremost that whatever subject that sees, the subject that hears and knows, etc., within his first person perspective and degree of knowing, is the subject that verily so upholds his existence, his reflection of the external world, residing within his internal will, so that perhaps it is to be understood now that a progressive history throughout the principle of time and of man's eventual arrival into his very form, not as an immediate conception but as a long and lasting development, from combusted fires and waters to fish and nematode, critter, land, animal, etc., is perhaps not as dependable or reliable as a theory, whereas more so credible and reasonable seems the theory that a certain individual in unique subjects made manifest and objectified into flesh, endowed with mental and magic powers, spiritual and personal will, etc., as coming from not the developed or progressing theory of time is monadistically earthly history, rather from the very will and idea made manifest from the very Creator Lord, that is precisely and exactly what clarifies the doubt and question behind the mystery of arrival in human flesh, understood under the notion of primal perceiving, sensing, and first-person perspective. it must be understood that the very world that the subject is born into is likewise rather one world of many disparate worlds, verging on the near infinite, that these worlds appear and make manifest within separate and distinct times, one world each within the possession of an individual will. These very worlds and the will within them all act accordingly to their very natures. However, it is that all the while the very Creator Lord peers into his tremendous hands, into the spiritual substances made manifest within these very hands, the many various worlds that are represented by individual subjects, all partaking in their conduct through the principle of sufficient reason, that is, through action and reaction in accordance with the very law that is inescapable, as designated by the will of the very Lord God. And what principle is more profoundly instituted and realized by the Lord than the naked and despotic reality of pain, sorrow, laments, and tragical death, enacted so and put into place by this Creator, for a rather very mystical and obscure purpose, one that the individual subject ought come to know through with enough time. That the very reality of pain and suffering and will and torment that plagues incessantly the very conduct and daily routine of the Lord's human creations is needless of any further illustration. It, on one hand, seems that the very painful elements within the worlds appear categorized in very various grades and degrees of impact in accordance as to however the more intellectual and knowing the man seems. The notion of this must be recognized early within the subject's mind, lest it not be understood or cared for within the subject's lasting lifetime. For no matter how hard or intentional an ordinary common mind bears his attention to understanding a principle, it shows to a great degree the value and merit of an individual that places himself within the very spectrum of the stars, and comes finally and for once to lasting peace, restoration, and compassionateness of mind, in relation to the other various forms within his matter, in regard to the very will that summons and upholds his very will, that summons and upholds his very world. Nevertheless, when it is so that the individual subject, that is, the one that sees and hears in reference and understanding to his very own body, the one that acts accordingly with the principle of sufficient reason, it seems that he must inevitably experience the time for him to undertake the struggle of recognizing and rationalizing the very idea of himself in his world of matter and forms, that he must understand that this very idea represents the notion of all the various worlds already expounded upon, of individual wills, that is, in relation to the knowing and seeing subjects, these individual wills as objectified and made external, that all the relations, associations, and various connections between himself and the other forms are merely positioned in time and space for the very purpose that sources back to the Lord God's wrath and will, the purpose of his meanings, aim, and intention to verily so punish, harm, mock at, revel with, enjoy, and ultimately rejoice at the very scheme and game of his matter creation, where all within his hands, this crystal ball of his, that there appears an almost but not quite infinite number of universes, stars, galaxies, nebulae, and worlds, that within these very worlds, known by ourselves, by the multifarious number of individually perceiving and sensing subjects, as Earth, the likely one and only world within each parallel universe, due to the consistency and relativity of such mystical and intuitive things found within this very Earth, such as the Kabbalah, the Tarot, Gematria, and such, meditation, confirmations, etc. It is so that this very Lord that envisions the many worlds of his, populated each with a knowing, sensing, perceiving subject, whether it be a man, woman, animal, fish, plant, insect, etc., he evidently administers within a scheme or game his idea of karma, where he a priori administers to each of his subjects a set and determined degree of varying pain and pleasure through causation and effect. For the subject's very experience, this determination of reason applies relatively rather fixed, as each subject within the many worlds dies, deceases, and ends within its sentence and reforms through spiritual adventure into another realm, with a renewed and born again karmatic will, within the hands of the Creator Lord. The very will that the subject conceives itself into, that will and inevitably experience must become known, altered, and transformed, just like it as is so under the principle and dominion of time and age. The very cause and effect, karmatic will that alters in accordance with the subject's very actions. It is so determined that by the Lord that his very mystic and obscure message to the millionfold subjects, fallen within their lot, made confused and deceived by tricks and sorceries from woman, serpent, ego, etc., the very message and notion the Lord likens to perceive within his subjects is the one by the name of mercy, compassion, and selfless love. compassion and selfless love for all the other forms and individuals within the almost infinite web of matter that every man, woman, child, beast, insect, fish, and plant even, that the individually knowing subject comes across with and experiences in his life, and his spirit be spared the terrible pain and torment of selfish desire and consummate craving or essential destruction, that all these things let themselves be as they may, do what they must, etc., with the care and kindness, love and good-heartedness for the Lord, he purely cheers for this nobility to being accredited and distributed among the various many subjects, most notably under the representation of humanity, whereas the animal, fish, plant, etc., cannot deny the striving and craving and reach for love so fully, but must proceed through additional alterations and transformations of its form, until it is met with itself renewed in human form, gifted with the skill of intellect and capability to reflection, outside the present moment, in order to bring about the necessary degree of striving and affliction that inevitably alters into the form and state of grace, love, compassion, and mercy. The various principles and ethics that thus established by the Christ and Buddha offer a great myriad of examples, so as it inevitably comes to an end, the end of the subject's life thus lived, it seems it is at all possible to attend toward eternal justice and reward from the Lord, an eternal end of subjective life, and return to a greatly ineffable, unspeakably profound, and powerfully reverential hall of the Creator Master. For once where this I is found without a matter of form, not steeped within the labyrinthine amazements of strife, struggle, suffering, and torment, this I that was once stationed here within this earth, yet worked and labored prolongedly and masterfully enough with the very ethics and morality handed down through the centuries for the great influential sages, ones within the knowledge of just what the Creator Lord dispassionately strives for his subject to achieve, his son to verily so become, and what this very thing is, love, regardless of the pain and irrational affliction that the very subject endures. For the Lord Creator owes to his Son, that is us, just this. Now we, as individualized, pluralistic egos, though inevitably and ultimately the various incarnations of the Lord's Son, the will within his hands, a crystal ball of reflection and thoughtful conception, the Lord that resides probably, from what can be perceived, from deep experiences in meditation and rational insight, within a vast and timeless spaceless and infinite marbled hall, filled with celestial and spiritual reward, probably a long feasting table that contains holiest of waters and holiest of foods, the hall replete and consistent of good-natured folk, though undoubtedly angelical beyond all description, where a kind of happiness and abundance lie eternally within and throughout, an eternal justice and reward for the achieved human subjects, the very will of the Lord that made it so far within the race, within the various worlds, in the time spent in a state of repentance, forgiveness, carefulness, and mercy, knowledge and understanding, compassion and love, ultimately freed himself from his human form, the will of the Lord, within the matter from the bondage and tyranny of his very former state, and inevitably reaching high enough to rise out and propel himself forward into the starry skies and heavens of fate and destiny, that is, to raise and enter once and forever into the hands of the Creator Lord, after the many numerous attempts spent in striving and struggling, once seasoned, born again, made new, however long it should take in order for him to reach the goal and victory he so lastingly and ultimately well deserves. February 12, 2011. To 22/2011. The world that of which I objectify into is a strange, confusing, mysterious, and ultimately grandiose manifestation, one that, physically and empirically speaking, is virtually impossible to depart from, as though I were to meet the very edge of the walls that encircle, encapsulate, and engulf the entire scope and vista of the universe in its very conception. I am as subject within the spirit and reflective vision of our Lord and Creator God, one that I am under the control and possession of, regardless whether I think selfishly that I am acting in this phenomenal world based upon my own free will. Every action has its purpose and its reason. I choose to perform an action based upon the prior motive, or motives, that determinedly call upon and set me to perform such a choice and thing. There ultimately resides and rests within the earth all the tangible and objectifiable elements, together with the substance of the very will, representing the objectified and reflectively knowing man. It seems as though that I, as a particular subject, have become called into the world and made capable and possible to experience this reality for this very purpose. It seems that on one hand, I could very well be something of an experiment by the will of the Creator God, as prior reflections upon various many subjects in regard to his interest have become evidenced and known of me. If this were so, perhaps when upon the death of my subjects I will make the return to a marble hall where the Lord Creator resides within. But I would like to know the answer to this question. If this course were so to be true, then when and where was I subjectively existing beforehand, that is, prior to the construction and conception of myself as I know myself here and now? Could it be that I was situated and settled beforehand right inside the marble hall of the Creator, wherein at the present I am sentenced to be returned to upon my physical immediate death? I recognize the notion that all matter and substance within the will of the Lord in this current life and spirit of mine evidence themselves and make themselves visible through the means of this very will, where the a priori archetypes and elements deep within the consciousness of the mind are remembered. As so it was said by Plato to the effect that all knowledge is remembering. Here it is known that knowledge, as it is stated, is related to the concept and reality of ideas, and that these very ideas are the archetypal and primary elements embedded deep within the life and spirit of the subject's knowing mind, so that it is these very ideas made manifest and visible in this objectified world that are becoming remembered. I think this ties in together the notion of my life and its spirit existing beforehand, a priori, that prior to this birth and conception of my life, as I am right now and writing this, that it could only be somewhat of an impossibility to not be born into this very spiritual and self-referential world without having existed in a life form of some kind prior to this very birth and conception of physical and objectified life and spirits. The question I pose here now, could it be that my life, or more clearly, this will and its drive and its suffering, were made positive and objective in the very marble hall of the Creator God that was spoken about already, and that it was there in that marble hall where and when I had resided and resolved to situate within, for all an eternity of time? But something in this question is precisely preposterous. It is that the notion of residing in a state and condition of life within the very hall of the Creator God, for all and ever in eternity, then up to a point in time where then I am set into the traps and mazes and abyss of this very phenomenal world, as I know it right here now, as perhaps a sentence or punishment for poor or maledictive behavior, while a priori being situated and residing inside that very hall of the Lord, but that only here am I, only in this life and spirit as I know it, to cease and desist from my physical dimension, to return for the second time to that very heavenly dimension of the Creator, only to go upon continuing to exist and to will in that hallowed and divine dimension without an end, and once again up to for all and ever in eternity of time. All this logical description, of course, is false, flawed, and inevitably doomed. It must be made clear, to correct and redefine the matter of all this, to set and to establish within the ground of the very philosophy, principles and doctrine that need to be made clear of what it is exactly that we are talking about and witnessing within this very lifetime, as it needs to be said in this life with everyone and everything involved within the current empirical, physical, and objectified phenomenal realm and dimension of life and spiritual will. So here the statement is as it is to be stated, that in regard to the essence and inner kernel of everything within this world, it appears, and in truth is, that the reality of everything comes from and summons into this very world from the same substance, essence, life, and spirit, sourcing directly from the marble hall of the Creator Lord and God. I state that the Lord God of this world resides within this kind of description of a marble hall only for the idea of this seems ideal or optimal in my possible description that I positively give of such a phenomenon, although in actuality and upon revelation of the form and description it may very well be that he and his dimension are formless, and verily so without a description. Nevertheless, it necessarily follows that, as was stated just now, that all life and spirit, objectified and made manifest into form within this phenomenal realm, be it man, woman, animal, fish, insect, plants, etc., whatever possesses a corporeal and formative body that is capable of willing and striving within some kind of inherited or acquired means, it is these very objectifications and manifestations of life that all source back to the very hall, that very ethereal and heavenly dimension of the Creator Lord and God. This might be open to much speculation, although it would logically and rightly so appear that, by likewise researching deeper into the formulation and structure of numerology, for aiding and assisting the purpose in recollecting together the answer and solution to just what this question might presuppose, the ethereal and heavenly dimension of the Lord and Creator God contains within him and alongside him, in that a priori pure heavenly realm, a son. Perhaps it is this son in the heavenly realm, in all his interaction, association, and socialization with his Creator, more so with his Father, that manifests and objectifies into this world as a particular and molecular spirit, a particular life form, a container of essence. So we have it that there exists an a priori dimension, that within it there represents and wills a grandiose marble and festive hall, a Creator God or Lord Father, that alongside with him there exists a Son, that as we pave the road further, interacts and associates with the Father. And perhaps even so, it is that time exists within the a priori realm. In fact, it must be true, for any quick reference toward the statements of Schopenhauer, Kant, Hegel, etc., would make reference to the truth and reality of this, that the principle of time is a priori, although these philosophers refer to this principle within the material and phenomenal realm. However, it is that on the Kabbalah, the number 3, the understanding, Bina, etc., is too representative of the concept and notion of time, whereas it is true that Sephirot of Bina transcends and is above the abyss of form and matter, that is, above the realm and condition of the number 4, and those latter numbers that succeed further into heavier and more concrete and corrupted matter. So now we have postulated that it is possible within the marble hall of the Lord God for a son to sufficiently age, although probably without form, as this ethereal and heavenly dimension is transcendent and surpasses from the phenomenon in an empirical realm in this world of ours. But it is further to be stated that if it appears strange that a heavenly dimension can age, it is only further to be likewise acknowledged that if it's so frequently and abundantly do we infer into and suggest about the spiritual power of the heavens and of God, the miraculous nature of him as so strongly evidenced, that there exists beyond our knowing realm such strange mysterious ideas, that the notion of age and the principle of time occurring in the heavenly realm, although totally within this realm, but in that heavenly realm, that is more than likely probably without form, without the form and descriptive substance that so routinely shapes and defines the character of ourselves. It is this notion that is more than likely to be enlisted as among the various other mysterious and miraculous natures of God, of the heavens, and of religious meditation. Anyhow, as we need more to mention, this very heavenly Son of the Creator God, within the marble hall, interacts and socializes with his heavenly Father. Perhaps even here, in this heavenly dimension, as the principle of formless time passes on within this dimension, the reality of all this is given probably that free choice, responsibility, and duty take into form within the spiritual dimension, at least probably within the very beginning and end of the Son's phenomenal life sentence into, for the first time, the phenomenal realm of the material world of matter, out of, for the very last time, the phenomenal realm of this material world of matter, that he, the Son, be given free choice and liberty in his direction, deliberations, and transactions while within this hall with the Creator, that the Son is initially tried and tested into this phenomenal realm as an experiment for the enjoyment and pleasure of the Father, to enter into this phenomenal realm, to realize and incarnalize the very motives, thoughts, actions, and feelings of the subject that had taken place within the spiritual and heavenly dimension, although it was something becoming old, boring, and tedious. The Lord is known to be in a state of wrath and vengefulness, so we take into account the idea that the Son entered into a state and condition between he and his Father, the original and archetypal dispute and battle that fragmentally and residually occurs here within the spiritual reflections of this very world. It should be made noted likewise the conception that as I derive a source from Wagner's Ring cycle, that Wotan in this particular opera drama represents our Father, that his very spear is made broken, that perhaps this is the very course of action that lands the Son of the Father, now speaking in reference to our philosophical realms and more closely to the heavenly dimension, that landed our Son for the first time in a state of abandonment, rejection, and exile, into a lost and disconnected state, into very real, concrete, and empirically material states, one lost, far off and distant from his a priori heavenly dimension, and now entering into very brutal, ungodly, unheavenly, hellish even, realm, a field of liars, deceivers, witches and sorcerers, tricksters and pickpocketers, hateful avengers and monstrous beasts, barbarians and stately, tyrannical law corrupters, everywhere it seems, within and throughout the abundance of the sharply more defined, striving, willing, suffering, crying and dying realm of the phenomenal soul and spirits, sentenced into life here upon this earth, at least so within the current cycle of the Sun and his existences within this phenomenal realm. Ragnarok plays an equally important part in the scheme and doctrine to all this, now that I reflect all the more upon the subject. Brunhilde's exile and abandonment into the material world and her loss and eviction of godly privilege within the Valkyrie finale provides excellently an additional example to this concept. Here it is so stated: we have it now that the Son of the Father within the heavenly dimension, in accordance with the a priori principle of time, this principle in form and action up there, regardless of whether or not there be any true or noble form, when finally unmasking ourselves in that dimension, the Father, or more than likely the Son alone, he becomes bored with his will, heavenly will that is, while up there, thus confronts with some mysterious means the infinite absolute spiritual will of the Lord Father, that the Father then upsets themselves, the Son is thrown into a state of reflective hell in consequence, thus doing so commences the long cycle of the Son's redemption and forgiveness in the eye of the Creator Lord, that it appears so the Son is manifest not once into this material world. It must be known that what transcends in scope and might, even the stars within our physical world, is infinitely greater and infinitely more gigantic and seemingly endless in the eyes of the incorporeal and ethereal being. So, in essence, the conception of the Son's multifarious course into the abyss, lost from the marble hall of the Creator God, probably banished beyond into the feral wilderness, where everything appears coarser and more sufferable. Perhaps here we make evidence beforehand the notion that the Son and the Father are made represented through the Kabbalah, that the Son probably as either Sephirot 2 or 3, that is either Chokmah or Bina, and that so the Kabbalah, or the universe as we know it, is divided into at most 10 parts, more definitively 4 elements, but as for 10 parts, with the 11th Sephirot as an inquisitive and middle ground between the material and celestial heavenly realms, that the 11th Sephirot represents the abyss and gateway entrance between these two realms, that probably it is so that upon the first incarnation of the Son into the physical and concrete realm, he has made up the elements and constituted the character of the number 6, the notion of sunlight in its primary form, with a selfish ego and incendiary troublesomeness between himself and the Emperor, that is in reference to the 5th card on the tarot. But that this very first and primary man must not have pleased his Heavenly Father well enough that a finite number of materialistic living cycles will come into succession, and it must be remembered that the notion of time in this physical world is abundantly more trivial and superfluous than that so residing within the marble hall of the Creator, that we are hence found winding up now with the perception of the relativity of our own forms in constitutions within our principle of sufficient reason, our time, our space, and our causality, or karma, so that currently within this era of ours we find for ourselves the continuance to will and to strive, to negate and destroy, hate and vilify. However, it is that our very will is apparently running thin, simply for by the perception and subsequent recognition of every subject that is present and physically manifest in occurring time, that is espousing a kind of doctrine of forgetfulness, nihilism, carelessness, and oblivious remorsefulness. It could very well be that it is this sentiment that makes evidence known to every subject of truth and reality of the coming forgivingness and acceptance of the Heavenly Father of ourselves, as we are His exiled and abandoned Son, divided into seemingly infinite parts, in the redemption and salvation of our last, final, dying and withering spirits, sentenced and returned right back into the very marble hall of the original Creator. Or it could be, as I'm speculating much on this topic, this only will pave the way further toward a more universal and complete understanding of the subject. I'm not looking for absolute correctness or total accuracy in these theories, right now at least, but it could be perhaps that, taking evidence and notice once more in the opera drama of Wagner's Ring Cycle, that verily so the twilight of the gods takes preeminence. The very last, final, dying, withering spirit of the knowing subjects were to die out actually and complete himself, without any redemption or forgiveness from the Father, without any return back into his very hall, for the Father himself were to die out, as I have throughout this writing made positive, the indirect reference to the Buddhistic doctrine and philosophy of samsara, and more importantly nirvana, that with so much time passing away, and as was clarified earlier the notion of the existence of the principle of time, even within throughout the heavenly dimension, that the very Father were to fall from his will, unwind his flame, disappear far off into the nether regions of the impossible and incurable nothingness of the eternal void. Perhaps the Father himself were not eternal at all, as it can be made evidence by the notion that through the means of Kabbalah, the absolute crown Godhead Father is represented, expressed in the means of the number 1, whereas there is a higher dimension beyond this separate, that it is verily so the position and direction of the void. Likewise, I refer to Crowley's doctrine of bracket Yod, close bracket, He, wow, He. Although there are 3 voids, with reference to any one student of interest in the Kabbalah, there cannot possibly be any such return to the will, the spirit of life, once the will has entered itself into the very void. In such events, with reference to where all these ideas tie in together with everything in the phenomenal world and with everything in the spiritual lifetime, the principal doctrine must be made understood, ethically clear, and practiced within this lifetime, that we, as various material and phenomenal subjects occurring in form within the principal time, that is, where we ourselves express physical, sensitive, and perceptive matter, content, and substance, that we all are positively one within the reflective and subjective currents residing within the crystal ball and rational law of the Lord's creative hands, thrown into spiritual reflection as a means of witnessing and subjecting to more coarser and brutally realistic punishments, that the substance and matter within the Lord's hands is not made any more or less finite, that the very duty and responsibility of the Son's will within his material lives is to become ever so willing, vengeful, and abundant and coarse in a sentence, so as to produce in effect a kind of turning away from his very will, where a longing and intelligent desire to return back home, upon now recognition of it, into his father's far off, distant, and once forgotten marble hall that belongs to him, and with his very master. Certain ethics of this subject make their decree. The closest the son gets to turn over a new leaf and to abolish the very sentence and damned construction of his father is by doing so compassionate, merciful, and beneficial acts toward his pluralistic multitude of subjects, the ones within the very arena of individuals' objectification. Although all of this is within his very reflection. It is these subjects within the Creator's Lord's hands that are given a set of eyes, a pair of ears, a couple of hands, and various other utilities for his senses, to perceive and to understand more accurately, more accordingly, the very earthly and material dimension he is sentenced into, soon within a sense of knowing better the contents of his very reflection, is more than less a delusion and deception, to the very tricks, sorceries, and divulgences that express and represent the will of the very Creator's material dimension that he rightly so and morally so subjected and exiled his very Son into. The Son is made manifest within this world as I write this and think of this right here and right now. I can see, hear, feel, and such through the direct and immediate will of the subject of creation, the fallen and begotten Son of the Heavenly Lord. The immediacy and certainty of these perceptions is made evident and witnessed through the seemingly endless amount of objectifications within this world and lifetime. Upon the death of me, I am, that is, my soul or my will, probably due to the recognition of my sentiments, the state and condition of my character, will undergo a spiritual transformation of its state and its organization, become manifest once again into one renewed, particular life form. This life form will see out of its eyes, hear out of its ears, feel from whatever means capable. The spirit will travel through the a priori principles of time, the space of causality. It finds for itself a suitable means to inhabit something once again right into phenomenal form. The life form can very well be evidenced by me as I'm right here, right now within my lifetime, though there seems to be a certain logical flaw within this reflection that may very well deride the credibility or validity of that very notion. In any event, throughout the expansion of this topic that I've been writing upon, I have indirectly made continuous reference to the concept of samsara, yet most importantly that of nirvana. Samsara represents the will of the Heavenly Son, made objectified, troubled, and difficult to escape from in such torment. Samsara and the will also make reference to the concept of the web of Maya. Study into Hindu and Buddhistic philosophy is tantamount in importance to arriving to a greater understanding of this processional dialogue. The will of samsara becomes released through enough time and patience of age. It is inevitable that the concept of nirvana, or the absence of any matter, formative or ideal or painfully positive, will be achieved. Nirvana and the negation of substance rightly go hand in hand. It seems that, taking into account our preceding dialogue of the Lord's will, that his marble hall, the very Son that he objectifies and abandons into the lonely and cruel world, it seems that this life spirit is a tragedy, for with enough time the Son repents enough into a negatively achieved state. The Father is already made deceased, and therefore cannot possibly meet his Son in any recognition, though it is likewise a tremendous release, for the Father has for so long a time remained wrathful, incurable, insufferable from his confliction with his exhilarated Son, so that in the end the Father is likewise found in a state of restoration and peace. So it is true to behold, I deposit the theory, reference, or idea that the Father's will is not eternal, though I do not deny the positiveness of the Father. I would rather like to recommend or suggest a concision connection and unitarianism between the doctrines of Judaic monotheistical Judaic monotheistical theism, that of which, with the doctrines of religious insight of Buddhistic and Brahmanistic notions of karma, metempsychosis, and nirvana, that of which, putting together with the notion of God, reconciling all of this with the spirit and tragical essence of Christ, thus the religiousness of Christianity and its ethical principles be not forgotten, and including all the while with varied references and suggestions to the Nordic visions of Valhalla, that this where I visualize the creation of the marble hall, that I make much reference to, that with these ideas put together can there make it transformed to some kind of religious insight that reconciles and harmonizes everything within the universe and within its world life. Once again, the knowledge of every distanced and dispersed religious insight. Likewise, where here I deposit my own distinct and original theories on the topics of causality and age, etc., so that there becomes more easily understood and recognized for whatever subject, to ultimately make the necessary amends within the hands of the Creator, for the Creator, and to renew the drive and desire more strongly, more further forward toward the inevitable and intellectual end that rightly so lasts within, longs within, and strives within the phenomenal knowing subject that becomes finally upon achieved. February 22, 2011. (2/23/2011). Counter-offensiveness and corrupt manipulation of pure positive ideas serve no merit or purpose. Not only is it an insult, a war cry, and injury to the primary original cause, but likewise it advances not a single part to culture, clarity, or wisdom. Doubt and attempted annihilation of truth inevitably turns into hatred and destruction of wicked lies, shallow dishonesty, and cowardly distortions. Everything we reason that wrongfully breeds among them. The fundamental rooted skepticism and characteristic pattern of subjective negation of everything possessing a clear notion of genuine positivity and intelligent purpose becomes tiresome and tedious. I'd like to work out all my theories on this question. Furthermore, I'll probably write endlessly upon this position, if thrown readily enough into the act. There is an essential, timeless, and endless conflict and struggle going on, one that appears directly conceived from the very dawn of mankind, in his ability to consciously reflect and create a dialectic between his comrades. The one struggle and conflict I refer to as the unique dichotomy between a gifted, intelligent, and talented genius individual and that of the underprivileged, ordinary, and more sufferable lot of the multitude of humanity. The development and strange reiteration of master and slave morality taken place has chanced for thousands of years. Not only in the current state of life is slave morality almost completely integrated and rampant in the mind of nearly every thinking man. I somehow recognize my difference and separation from this, my giftedness, etc., and thus am one of the few individuals that can stand apart from this. The result is an inevitable struggle, clash, and conflict with almost every part of the whole of my world. Yet, as I am still human and remain bound to my feelings upon every redundant return to my will, it is inevitable that likewise will I feel a great degree of frustration for all of this, having the need to expose and unmask the true nature of nearly all the humanity I am fallen to surround within, to surround myself within my lifetime. February 23, 2011. (2/25, 2011). A distant, dispersed, and detached spark, fallen from the will of the Creator God, lying in dormancy beyond the dominion of the very world and universe. A chosen soul and fiery spirit, sent into form and endowed with the conception of character and consciousness, recapitulation into the intellect and a finer reflection, storm and thunder somewhere deep within the envelopment of saturnine mists. In the raising and foremost classification of human spirits, we will ourselves into this very day. A statement of character, empirical, determined, and intelligibly spiritual, upon birthright and conception, this form of ourselves, the state that succeeds into the currents of the very day, herein integrated with fire, heat, wisdom, and a profound determination of genuine and fatherly nobility, the kingly imperial personification of classifiable substance, we make necessary and seek the definitive wisdom that once lost before our very eyes, upon our sentence into this material existence, a flock of gradually diminishing, receding value, worth, with insight and delineation of purposive will, everything in possession of rationality, whether it be regarded as virtuous or despicable, the collective heart in a state that beats only for the fool, the sheep, and the ordinary mob. It is not always such a case. We strive to bring about the understanding of this observation, likewise among other things. The seed that is bestowed upon ourselves represents the very nobility we speak of in light and heartfelt compassion. The primary side of the psychological spectrum deserves the necessity to shine brilliantly, unguarded and untroubled by the wicked hands of the misunderstanding crowd herd. A great willing desire to seek our salvation, to do so through the essence of the multitudinous will. For wisdom and truth, clearest truth is needed in order to succeed in universal acclamation and assimilation, not to be left in the dark in the muddled study of a forgotten textbook or form of essay. We recognize the very truth of our compassion. We perceive also the shallowness, falsity, and deception of the great, massive generations of the universe and time. However, we perceive only by reason the knowledge of such a trap, not from being born fixed within the will. In acquisition of spirit, it is possible eventually to achieve a desired state of greatness, the high intelligence and artistic refinement, throughout the various multitudes of the street, the medium, the office, etc., through enough purity and clarity of composition, through enough transformation and evolution of form and substance, with time that succeeds inevitably into the richest and truest of paths toward the everlasting and justifiable end. We fear the abundant misuse and humiliation that forgoes our characters throughout the many decades and centuries to come. The reality of our characters becomes unknowable and transfigured in a forgotten mutilated carnage, one that appears tantamount into a state of credibility and validation. We never wish for such things to occur, even to the multitude, although with the lack and almost total absence of the capability for it to reason and to know, without any will, to apprehend something with the sense of understanding, mercy, and care. The negative degree of the destruction of our character and of our few comrades relative to our own will inevitably occur. We meet with and correspond with a very few and select number of individuals containing the possession of a sonic degree to great intelligence, radical skill, and capability to clear evaluation and expression of ideas within the scope, knowledge, and realm of a faculty to reason. Elsewhere, we experience our subjection through the means of certain media, one that give birth to the notion that some characters within the grade of our thoughts still exist and are alive within our lifetime. Other realms we peer into give ourselves the notion that great minds still exist. In this case, they have once existed through the medium of books, writing, music, art, the saving and preserving of data and information of whatever subject hereupon conveyed. Without these directions and validations of great merit and artistic worth, we are thus plummeted and thrown into the great tumult and categorical craziness, stupidity, lies, and chaos of our current generation. However, we remain, still to this very day, with interests to hint and console the various many subjects into a more inspired and enlightened state, driven away from the current shallowness and worthlessness, selfish personal aims of the moment, so that with our effort and drive to doing better things, coupled with the notion that we are still alive, in possession of our very spirit and pure intellect, it becomes ensured to us that the whole world and the very universe we represent has not succumbed already so unalterably and perpetually to the very delusions and coarse dullness that the wicked will of the Lord so furiously manifests in us within this lifetime. Thus our lives appear fresher. We study the psychology of humanity, the nature of this world. We communicate and transmit information and knowledge studied from above, with a desire to learn, and in the waking of minds of the various subjects we still associate with in this lifetime, knowing that the ultimate end of all upright humanity is not yet come to be achieved, nor will it ultimately be so, for it is thought with the very will of a few unique and gifted individuals that remains still within this time, along with whatever intelligible substance that remains, either through writing, art, music, or ideas that are still made available from the past, from famed and genuine artists of various days. These forces preserved in action represent the inevitable return to a gifted and skilled degree of intelligence of collective humanity that it is to occur, although the reality of such a thing may take likely centuries or millennia to attain. It seems as though everything has its cycles within the universe. It is likewise agreeable and evident in the state of humanity and of its intelligence too. But the most recent 2,000 years or so of moral conduct within the various stages of civilization in history has there unfortunately been consistent with intelligible ideas, the very sad and ultimately pathetic conduct and sorrowful ethical approach to everything profound and significant. A human condition that wrongfully hates and vilifies the notion and observance of any intelligent, genuine, gifted, and noble intellect, the archetype of the wolf among the sheep. In order to preserve the existence of the sheep's mediocrity, it becomes necessary for the sheep to circumnavigate through the various rules and laws of human order and conduct, to recreate, transfigure, and re-evaluate the morality and Weltanschauung approach of its life with the very source in opposition to its ambition, if any ambition they so be, for the very wolf that creates for the sheep's consistent outlook of fear, jealousy, vengefulness, cunning skepticism, possible envy, at least in a certain percentage of the herd, in an ultimately passive-aggressive hatred, a kind of indirect, silent coldness to the very will, words and achievements the master morality creates, conducts, observes, and evaluates within the scope and dimension of his life and of his conduct, manipulation of form, of pure and positive ideas. Everything the master beholds, apprehends, and shares into the lives of the other subjects within his world. Sadly, these subjects mostly be sheep. They respond to his master in his sheep's way, as though misused and assaulted by their husbandmen. Negative counter-reformation takes place. The desire to negate and dismiss the positive and healthy views or values of the master takes total control and concentration of their poisonous will of the non-unique herd. The various cunning subjects concoct for themselves behind the perception of the master various tricks in order to bring him down and devaluate him of all or any sense of his worth. They feel such evil sentiments in regard to gifted and brilliant individuals. Such a thing stirs within the multitude the possible truth and reality of the inferiority of the many subjects, the possibility of hollowness and dispiritedness of the composition, the idea of the great lack of spirit that the opposition rightfully so is in possession of, and thus beholding, is felt through the herd, the need to secure for itself a clumsy yet simplistic existence. Certain prophecies take place in the various realms of collective idealistic thought. God transforms and redeems the will of his subjects. The whole dimension and field of thought, once covered with two sides of the spectrum, now blankets, veils, and masks the great masterful side with one universal doctrine. A doctrine that contains at once both, unfortunately, which at the same time represents none other than only the feeble and proletarian side of the spectrum. For all kinds of doubt and trouble occurs in any of the remaining upright willing subjects, willing to liberate themselves from, to abolish control for this kind of manipulative and illusionary sorcery. One that also has unfortunately spread far enough into the inundated veins and systems of nearly every philosophical thought within the realms and fields of diametrical vision that once contained a great various many subjects under the control and possession of a greater, fiercer, more masculine, more fiery will and subjection. A character of health, spirit, and action, mind of health, mind of wealth, giftedness, and wisdom. It seems as though that the whole possibility of freedom of the subject to will anything within the confines and chambers of the greater morality is ruled out, cancelled, and nullified, much for within his lifetime, for the very religious sentiment, dubiety, and moralistic preposterousness nearly completely intoxicates and makes sterile the sagacity and healthiness of the subject into a great decompositive corpse within a vast and rendered wasteland of senility, insanity, and stupidity. For the very corrupt doctrine we are in reference to is in essence the representation and idealization of every such virtue we desire and hasten to strive away from within a state of such decay. Upon exposure and repentance from such wicked holiness, it appears as though there is likely needed a great power to adumbrate and nullify the whole essence and substance of such a vile and sickly form of human spell and moral conduct. The wolf turns stupefied, yet regains his composure from the sorcerer's spell. He ravages the lot of his opposition. In return, regenerates the world with the spiritual and soulful reformation and a higher aspiration for the very will, for the very trap. Nevertheless, much work and studious operation is needed to be done in order to purge from the mind the timeless and degenerating spells and evil sentiments that is needed not to overlap, develop, or engrave any further into the mind, into the memory and the imagination of the upright human subject and the gifted spirit of the will within the broad multitude of sleeping, weeping, dormant, and lying, yet ultimately reawakened and redefined, greater and more noble state of the very world. February 25, 2011. February 5, 2011. Underneath a mortifying divisionary spell, within a possession of thousands of concepts, words, and ideas, inside a dominion of thoroughly encapsulated decay, more than likely outside the central position of the will, a periphery that represents the circumscribable populace would not ever reason well enough in the hand of chance and purity, ultimately bringing about the downfall and catastrophic end of the West, a civilizing empire known about with such a unique and positive yet mysteriously mistaken identity. We ask for an answer. We verge onto near incessant lunacy, a grand metamorphosis in transliteration of truth into gluttonous willing and vernacular spasming. Our death, simplistic and at last, millions of revelations, relations and references of spiritual truth, a possession within the darkest wind storms, a chastised statement of positive truth, without giving away all the energy, power, or force behind the coming blitzkrieg reaction. A slow, morbid, yet comical and ironic realization of everything that we once were. The phallus overwhelmed our subjects in ever more secretive and obscurity, fancied as though ready to implode. Hilarity at the progress of fantasy, the pain of understanding such psychological truth, retreat into a gigantic, tumultuous, titanic abyss, location not known, likely to surf in the middle of nowhere, deep in the greatest, blackest, and bleakest of tempests, reference to occult propaganda, consultation of chemical wedding, rush and high-velocity speed thrust into all lost visionary ethereal conception, the stand at the doomed crossroad of a penultimate reflection, a maintenance of provisionary force, obscured numerological mysticism in a state of presupposition, twins and scales, departed to the Gemini and Libra astrological zodiac, only during departure, a tributary statement to distant aeonical artistic representation, remembrance of tempestuous winds. We leave our spatial dimension without any venture into plurality or divisionary substance. Beginning of our birth, again, rebirth, final tributary to all our comical history, a grudge that bears perplexingly upon the difficulty of trying to understand everything through and through, rub the knowledge deep into the skull, a mind and spirit of rapacious, rabbinical thrust and counter-destruction, without any necessity to alter the absolutely doomed condition that we have fallen into. Fire chariots, nearby smiles, simply space and the extension of it into relative spheres, caring less and less whether we are ever to be understood, laughter and jest everlastingly in regard to the vast and enormous degree of hidden knowledge and spiritual inception that we were capable of understanding within ourselves, for ourselves, and ultimately by ourselves alone. Entrance of a thought, although petty at first, yet with positive, albeit prudent intention. We ask ourselves, is here a positive thought? We call ourselves thus into the question. Our poetry that sources back into the groundwork and establishment of the very long lost and almost forgotten principles in regard to the first coming utilization of truth and concise philosophical manners and conceptions that of which we called upon ourselves initially to commence a profound examination and strive for an explanation of everything within the scope and dimension of our particular representation within our very world. We laugh once more together, yet with a motivation of concealing and masking the very principles for the likely foolish slave that still intelligibly confronts ourselves with such a doctrine. Again, a revelation and unleashing of fury attained from within, a showmanship in poetical and philosophical matter at once, although not any more. Gazing around ourselves, we behold a recollection of numerological wisdom. It is time we enter in, although prolonging it hesitatively. Memory of the ancients, all is one and one is the same. It happens. Chaos, radical confusion, and stricken pandemonium. Confession of a lack of better wisdom, of knowledge, and of character. For sake of a better fate, they deny it thus either way. Gazing around ourselves further, a negation of irritable substance gratefully thus subsides, to say something profound yet simplistic, a return and regression to a better time, a better place, a better age, reminiscences of an older, more primitive and archetypal force, the poetry, the influences, the significance, returning to an easier reality, almost ready to attain it through the deepest, most serious concatenation of meditative will. Memory of the ancients, the many conceptions of such an individual's regard to our reality are monstrous, ever the more monstrous, going more. Such reality is not as bad as it seems when we are thus awakened. Our dream becomes a reality, a thorough recognition and classification of objects within this journey through time. Fire and water, air and earth. I raised on the jewel-encrusted throne, my subjects enthralled to greet me. Yet, as I awaken, I recognize still within a fear and disdain, lamenting the deep inevitable destruction and annihilation of my character, and the emperor as I am. I remembered time and time again, in a deep state of justifiable meditation, obscure dialectic and inquisitive detail, a thing in itself and an idea of its becoming removed by substantial force and primitive fury of mediocre and multitudinous hordes of slaves, serfs, and plebeians. I meditated upon this reality, apprehended ever so much the notion through an a priori understanding, brought about by scholarly research and labyrinthine wandering through mazes of lost and forgotten books and tomes within the most decrepit and timeless of librarian infrastructures. I willed thus for my death. I willed it. Upon reminiscences of strange, dubious, yet innocent and more docile times, I recalled the weird eccentricity of my character more or less, before and after such succession. The morality and practice, and the ethics and concentration upon which followed, soft and hard in itself, weak and strong, doubt and power, water and fire, female and male, left and right, will and intellect, position and negation and such. For every action, for every judgment, knowledge, reason and such, there appears at once for the choice and decision only one partial determination of this psychological spectrum. As nature willed it, inescapably so, a subject is caused to impart into it every decision, deliberation, or reflection. Thus it is the end for the ones who deposit everything the more positively, yet the ones who are bound and determined by their custom towards a negative end. Even the greatest of monuments, towers of ivory, monoliths of stone, these fall into a great state of corruption and disintegration, becoming ever the more decayed. Regardless, this does not matter, for even the hardest, stiffest, and most regal imperator shall eventually fall, become lost or fully destroyed, in a state of perpetual madness, such as within the mind and spirit of the greatest geniuses, for the craftsman and physiological warriors, all becomes dust and forms into stone. An absolute, categorical, definitive, irreplaceable end, brought about, made manifest, and complete from the prolonged struggle through means of diabolical, infernal, waste-like maniacal sorcery, objectified within the darkest, most horrid, abominable dwelling positions in all of possible earth, laughter, scourge, mockery at the vain hope of reuniting the twain sides of the geological spectrum. Once again, the ethereal recollections and reminiscences of Gemini and Libra. Is it all possible? Thus complete our actions, there arises within us the possibility to manifest it all once again. We gaze into ourselves, around the earth and heavens, with all its natural beauty and harmony, flowers and petals, meadows and lakes and such, a vast expansive atmosphere, an environmental arena, one that gives way to a state of such inspiration as to perhaps have ourselves shout in ecstatic joy with an oblivious disregard to whatever location the present subject may thought to be in, at the notification and observance of ourselves with the phenomenal heavenly and paradise-like state of nature and subliminal beauty. But we must not get too carried away with this ideality. We thus remember the very impending reality of our death, the state of distress and estrangement that through enough carnage and inevitable suffering every one of ourselves throughout every succeeding moment of the current time must experience. Even of the feeling of slight gravity and depth infers and calls into this beautiful representation of the heavenly expression, the coming funerality of our life spirit. By feeling this, we remember all the troubles of our historical progression. We are thus bound to subsequently follow through with the end in itself. We recognize thus the vanity of nature once again. Beauty loses its appeal. The flowers once blossomed and felt lush within now thus withers away. It seems all but nothingness must remain, nothingness and emptiness. We enter into a vast expanse of a great vista, lost deep in a long forgotten memory, unable to make sense or reason out of anything, recollection far off in a distant happening. Even as such were forever without significant meaning or purpose, we recoil from the evil that always is within ourselves, do not feel we are dead even further. Amputation of limbs, decapitation of heads, emergency of a cut tape of Cirrus, a tape of cinema and film that we seemingly forever were thereto lost in such gaze at, becoming finished and done. Strange numerical data, information that does not make sense to intelligible human subjects. Hard, powerful, stone-cut, marbled words appear before what remains of the very lost and forgotten eye. Rigid pronouncements, a vague reference to heavenly, nearly unknowable symbols and ideas. Chalices, ethereal swords, grail halls, at a state of fourfold penultimate sufficient reason. The Lord speaks thus, was this not the work of thine own? As I am thee, thou art I. The recollection, thou art doomed to repeat this work over and over again, as it is thy destiny and thus a responsibility. Behold all summons, behold all thoughts, thou that once existed must thence exist evermore. Thus learn thee to adapt. Take pain for thy pleasure, pain is thy God's reward, thine inevitable reward to cherish before thee positively. Now thou understand thy purpose of creation, fair child. Heavenly sequence ends. In envelopment of fog and mist, a gradual residuary lift, unmasking an emergence of form, objects and everyday mundane ideas and concepts. Here remains beside the subject the very knowledge of the unending, everlasting life-death cycle, through the manifest objectification of a blackest, most volatile woodland structure. We are in a cabin, surrounded within a pine wood. A recollection and recall of adventures through such a wood, a deja vu of Nordic warrior visions, reality and inevitability of death, of they and of ye, of all within the trap, inevitability of war, a self-invasive chaos and titanic clash, the very origination of God's will, are thus emerging positivity. Think back, reflect further on and on. Remember the evil intentions within. Even now I'd rather be elsewhere. Heaven and hell in all its methods, modes, and demonstrations of slave morality. Heaven and hell in all its methods, modes, and demonstrations of master morality. It literally beckons thee to writhe in thy form of profoundest distress, and ultimately recognize morality where it is known that every subject thus comes to life from a being deceased sometime a priori. As it is then studied upon, the representative theory reflects both the reality and behavior of slave morality, the reality and behavior of master morality, a beginning of positivity, an end of negation, this of which represents the master moralist, a beginning of negativity, an end of position, this of which belongs to the categorical determination of the slave moralist. The slave is here, there, everywhere within the particular life and spirit of the eye, in a renewed and regenerated form. Here that barely affords any transcendental escape into a heavenly dimension, far removed from the sorrowful reality of this weakly sociable state of the eye. Thy curse, thy sentence of thy fate, O wise, fallen, and forgotten brothers of the stars. As it proceeds, it progresses thus. A historical tyranny befalls our lot, that of which is summoned by the name or representation of Roma, wherein the Judaic slave, from which the Christian ethos thus arose, it inevitably altered and transformed their state and condition of Roman life spirit, consequently enthroning into position and situating into command the hand of the Tullian Germanicus within the state of the West. The German thus rules and tyrannizes such and such. The fate becomes sealed as it is wished. The West of itself falls into the trap of the now poisonous and decadent world into international slaves. The originative example of the West thus falls, so does the rest of the very world. Inspired and motivated by the process and demonstration of such destructive self-interior motives, as the first be of the last, so the last be of the first. A crown of thorns thus ultimately rests upon the head of the last man, ultimately vanishes the world without a trace into the dusty nether realms and dimensions of comedic, foolish, yet darkest and most tragically serious nothingness, emptiness and penultimate void, in resigned, funereal and triumphant state of death, annihilation and destruction. So thus it is the end. March 5, 2011. (3/14/2011). Media credit. Belinda Callan. Used with kind permission. The Telescope. Issue date 3/14/11. Skills with the Black and White by Natalie Sodoff. Ode was considered the next child piano prodigy at the age of 7 by adults who viewed him playing and practicing. After exploring his talents through performance and in soles, he has found the practice rooms at Palomar to be most satisfying of all. Odin said his talent was born unexpectedly when Bestla decided to share her love of the piano. He took to the instrument immediately. It was a mutual cooperation. Bestla began teaching me to play the piano around the age of 6, Odin said. It lasted all of about 2 weeks, then I took off on my own. It was rather self-taught. I was rather self-taught up to the age of 18, really. Very few lessons in between. It wasn't so much of a playing around, it was a really studious and assiduous job and responsibility, he added. Odin's Bor and Bestla said they knew that there was a strong relationship between Odin and those 88 keys. He had speed and forcefulness on the keys. Bohr, who is Hirner, said in an email. Bohr and Bessler decided to send him to a private piano instructor, but that didn't last long. Odin had his first instructor at the age of 10. This lasted for maybe a year or less, and I think it might be because I excelled and advanced past the ability of that teacher. So I just returned to self-teaching for quite a while, Odin said. He continued his musical career by participating in the music department at each of his schools. His talent was marked to the memory of fellow school musicians. I met Odin 10 years ago in middle school when I was 13. I'd hear him play Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies and Chopin's Etudes like a professional. Odin, a friend of Odin's, said through email. Odin can sight read and play a song for the first time better than anyone I've ever met. It has always been an extremely talented musician technically and emotionally, she added. Throughout his teen years, Odin discovered that the piano allowed a unique way to communicate his views of the world around him. I've always been honest about my work, and I don't want to put too much business aspect into it. My music is art and feeling and internal strife and peace, too. A kind of rest and restoration, Odin said of his music. You can style yourself in a unique way, and I think that's what the case was with me, he added. After high school, Odin decided to attend Palomar. He enrolled in the fall of 2005 with hopes of becoming a concert pianist after obtaining a bachelor's degree in music performance. That was my dream, my idealization. It just went on since the age of 6 until probably the age of 19. Odin said. After attending classes for a couple of years, Odin found that life as a performer wasn't what he wanted. I was hoping to send him to a music conservancy school, Bohr, who's Hirner, said, but that didn't happen for different reasons. Around age 21, he seemed to lose interest in a piano playing career. Felt the competition for a decent paying job in that field was too great. His music interest was too limited, too narrow to find work. Odin stopped attending classes and has since turned to philosophy and religion to help mature and direct his life in his music. Odin sensed a change in maturity in Odin's music within the last couple of years. He has diverged into two styles of music that he writes. The first style is slow, melodic, and bittersweet. The second style is atonal and logic-oriented rather than emotional, she said. Though not enrolled in classes, Odin still comes to Palomar to play his music. Odin hopes to both inspire and be inspired while practicing his music around students. The students see profound talent in my ability to interpret compositions, and also the sight-reading ability that I have. They come to me quite a bit to test out pieces for them to get a sound knowledge of what it sounds like, and they will do that quite a bit, Odin said. I'm happy just to play for myself, and I want to play for other people, and I can do that by just returning to the college. He added, there are practice rooms with people around that can hear my music. I feel like I can acquaint myself with the atmosphere, the air, the external subject. That's something that I feel happy doing because I'm playing for other people, not in a concert hall or opera house. Odin plays piano for many Palomar projects. He says he is self-taught and has been playing since he was 6 years old. March 14, 2011.